Chapter 21 of The Mark of Zorro. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. This recording is by Mark Smith of Simpsonville, South Carolina. The Mark of Zorro by Johnston McCulley. Chapter 21. The Whipping. The natives jeered and applauded. Don Diego's face went white, and for an instant his eyes met those of Fray Felipe, and in the face of the latter he saw resignation. The office was cleared, and the soldiers led the fray to the place of execution in the middle of the plaza. Don Diego observed that the magistrado was grinning, and he realized what a farce the trial had been. "These turbulent times!" he said to a gentleman of his acquaintance who stood near. They tore Felipe's robe from his back and started to lash him to the post. But the Fray had been a man of great strength in his day, and some of it remained to him in his advanced years, and it came to him now what ignominy he was to suffer. Suddenly he whirled the soldiers aside and stooped to grasp the whip from the ground. "You have removed my robe," he cried. "I am man now, not Fray. One side, dogs!" He lashed out with the whip. He cut a soldier across the face. He struck at two natives who sprang toward him, and then the throng was upon him, beating him down, kicking and striking at him, disregarding even the soldiers' orders. Don Diego Vega felt moved to action. He could not see his friend treated in this manner despite his docile disposition. He rushed into the midst of the throng, calling upon the natives to clear the way. But he felt a hand grasp his arm, and turned to look into the eyes of the magistrado. "These are no actions for a caballero," the judge said in a low tone. "The man has been sentenced properly. When you raise hand to give him aid, you raise hand against his excellency. Have you stopped to think of that, Don Diego Vega?" Apparently Don Diego had not, and he realized, too, that he could do no good to his friend by interfering now. He nodded his head to the magistrado and turned away. But he did not go far. The soldiers had subdued Fray Felipe by now, and had lashed him to the whipping post. This was added insult, for the post was used for none except insubordinate natives. The lash was swung through the air, and Don Diego saw blood spurt from Fray Felipe's bare back. He turned his face away then, for he could not bear to look. But he could count the lashes by the singing of the whip through the air, and he knew that proud old Fray Felipe was making not the slightest sound of pain, and would die without doing so. He heard the natives laughing, and turned back again to find that the whipping was at an end. "The money must be repaid within 2 days, or you shall have 15 lashes more," the magistrado was saying. Fray Felipe was untied and dropped to the ground at the foot of the post. The crowd began to melt away. 2 frailes who had followed him from San Gabriel aided their brother to his feet, and led him aside while the natives hooted. Don Diego Vega returned to his house. "Send me Bernardo," he ordered his despensero. The butler bit his lip to keep from grinning as he went to do as he was bidden. Bernardo was a deaf and dumb native servant, for whom Don Diego had a peculiar use. Within the minute he entered the great living room and bowed before his master. "Bernardo, you are a gem," Don Diego said. "You cannot speak or hear, cannot write or read, and have not sense enough to make your wants known by the sign language. You are the one man in the world to whom I can speak without having my ears talked off in reply. You do not 'ha' me at every turn." Bernardo bobbed his head as if he understood. He always bobbed his head in that fashion when Don Diego's lips ceased to move. "These are turbulent times, Bernardo," Don Diego continued. "A man can find no place where he can meditate. Even at Fray Felipe's night before last there came a big sergeant pounding at the door. A man with nerves is in a sorry state, and this whipping of old Fray Felipe. Bernardo, let us hope that this Señor Zorro, who punishes those who work injustice, hears of the affair and acts accordingly." Bernardo bobbed his head again. "As for myself, I am in a pretty pickle," Don Diego went on. "My father has ordered that I get me a wife, and the señorita I selected will have none of me. I shall have my father taking me by the ear in short order. Bernardo, it is time for me to leave this pueblo for a few days. I shall go to the hacienda of my father, to tell him I have got no woman to wed me yet, and ask his indulgence. And there, on the wide hills behind his house, may I hope to find some spot where I may rest and consult the poets for one entire day without highwaymen and sergeants and unjust magistrados bothering me. And you, Bernardo, shall accompany me, of course. I can talk to you without your taking the words out of my mouth." Bernardo bobbed his head again. He guessed what was to come. It was a habit of Don Diego's to talk to him thus for a long time, and always there was a journey afterward. Bernardo liked that, because he worshipped Don Diego, and because he liked to visit the hacienda of Don Diego's father, where he always was treated with kindness. The despensero had been listening in the other room, and had heard what was said, and now he gave orders for Don Diego's horse to be made ready, and prepared a bottle of wine and water for the master to take with him. Within a short time Don Diego set out, Bernardo riding a mule a short distance behind him. They hurried along the high road, and presently caught up with a small carreta, beside which walked two robed Franciscans, and in which was Fray Felipe, trying to keep back moans of pain. Don Diego dismounted beside the carreta as it stopped. He went over to it and clasped Fray Felipe's hands in his own. "My poor friend," he said. "It is but another instance of injustice," Fray Felipe said. "For 20 years we of the missions have been subjected to it, and it grows. The sainted Junipero Serra invaded this land when other men feared, and at San Diego de Alcala he built the first mission of what became a chain, thus giving an empire to the world. Our mistake was that we prospered. We did the work, and others reaped the advantages." Don Diego nodded, and the other went on. "They began taking our mission lands from us, lands we had cultivated, which had formed a wilderness and which my brothers had turned into gardens and orchards. They robbed us of worldly goods, and not content with that, they now are persecuting us. The mission empire is doomed, caballero. The time is not far distant when mission roofs will fall in and the walls crumble away. Some day people will look at the ruins and wonder how such a thing could come to pass. But we can do naught except submit. It is one of our principles. I did forget myself for a moment in the plaza at Reina de los Angeles, when I took the whip and struck a man. It is our lot to submit." "Sometimes," mused Don Diego, "I wish I were a man of action." "You give sympathy, my friend, which is worth its weight in precious stones. And action expressed in a wrong channel is worse than no action at all. Where do you ride?" "To the hacienda of my father, good friend. I must crave his pardon and ask his indulgence. He has ordered that I get me a wife, and I find it a difficult task." "That should be an easy task for a Vega. Any maiden would be proud to take that name." "I had hoped to wed with the Señorita Lolito Polito, she having taken my fancy." "A worthy maiden. Her father, too, has been subjected to unjust oppression. Did you join your family to his, none would dare raise hand against him." "All that is very well, Fray, and the absolute truth, of course. But the señorita will have none of me," Don Diego complained. "It appears that I have not dash and spirit enough." She is hard to please, perhaps. Or possibly she is but playing at being a coquette, with the hope of leading you on and increasing your ardour. A maid loves to tantalize a man, caballero. It is her privilege. I showed her my house in the pueblo, and mentioned my great wealth, and agreed to purchase a new carriage for her, Don Diego told him. Did you show her your heart, mention your love, and agree to be a perfect husband? Don Diego looked at him blankly, then batted his eyes rapidly and scratched at his chin, as he did sometimes when he was puzzled over a matter. What a perfectly silly idea! He exclaimed after a time. Try it, caballero. It may have an excellent effect. Chapter 22. Swift Punishment. The frailes drove the cart onward. Fray Felipe raised his hand in blessing, and Don Diego Vega turned aside into the other trail, the deaf and dumb Bernardo following at his heels on the mule. Back in the pueblo, the dealer in hides and tallow was the centre of attraction at the tavern. The fat landlord was kept busy supplying his guests with wine, for the dealer in hides and tallow was spending a part of the money of which he had swindled Fray Felipe. The magistrado was spending the rest. There was boisterous laughter as one recounted how Fray Felipe lay about him with the whip, and how the blood spurted from his old back when the lash was applied. Not a whimper from him, cried the dealer in hides and tallow. He is a courageous old coyote. Now, last month we whipped one at San Fernando, and he howled for mercy, but some men said he had been ill and was weak, and possibly that was so. A tough lot, these frailes, but it is great sport when we can make one howl. Ha ha! More wine, landlord! Fray Felipe is paying for it. There was a deal of raucous laughter at that, and the dealer's assistant, who had given perjured testimony, was tossed a coin and told to play a man and do his own buying, whereupon the apprentice purchased wine for all in the inn and howled merrily when the fat landlord gave him no change from his piece of money. Are you afraid that you pinch coins? The landlord asked. Those in the tavern howled with merriment again, and the landlord, who had cheated the assistant to the limit, grinned as he went about his business. It was a great day for the fat landlord. Who was the caballero who showed some mercy toward the fray? The dealer asked. That was Don Diego Vega, the landlord replied. He will be getting himself into trouble. Not Don Diego, said the landlord. You know the great Vega family, do you not, senor? His Excellency himself curries their favour. Did the Vegas hold up as much as a little finger, there would be a political upheaval in these parts. Then he is a dangerous man, the dealer asked. A torrent of laughter answered him. Dangerous? Don Diego Vega? The landlord cried, while tears ran down his fat cheeks. You will be the death of me. Don Diego does not but sit in the sun and dream. He scarcely ever wears a blade, except as a matter of show. He groans if he has to ride a few miles on a horse. Don Diego is about as dangerous as a lizard basking in the sun. But he is an excellent gentleman for all that, the landlord added hastily, afraid that his words would reach Don Diego's ears, and Don Diego would take his custom elsewhere. It was almost dusk when the dealer in hides and tallow left the tavern with his assistant, and both reeled as they walked, for they had partaken of too much wine. They made their way to the carreta in which they travelled, waved their farewells to the group about the door of the tavern, and started slowly up the trail toward San Gabriel. They made their journey in a leisurely manner, continuing to drink from a jug of wine they had purchased. They went over the crest of the first hill, and the pueblo of Reina de los Angeles was lost to view, and all they could see was the highway twisting before them like a great dusty serpent, and the brown hills, and a few buildings in the distance, where some man had his hacienda. They made a turning and found a horseman confronting them, sitting easily in the saddle, with his horse standing across the road in such a manner that they could not pass.
"Turn your horse, turn your beast," the dealer in hides and tallow cried. "Would you have me drive over you?"
The assistant gave an exclamation that was part of fear, and the dealer looked more closely at the horseman. His jaw dropped, his eyes bulged.
"'Tis Signor Zorro!" he exclaimed. "By the saints! 'Tis the curse of Capistrano away down here near San Gabriel. You would not bother me, Signor Zorro? I'm a poor man and have no money. Only yesterday a fray swindled me, and I have been to Reina de los Angeles seeking justice."
"Did you get it?" Signor Zorro asked.
"The magistrado was kind, signor. He ordered the fray to repay me, but I do not know when I shall get the money."
"Get out of the carreta, and your assistant also," Signor Zorro commanded.
"But I have no money,"
the dealer protested. "Out of the carreta with you! Do I have to request it twice? Move, or lead finds a lodging place in your carcass." Now the dealer saw that the highwayman held a pistol in his hand, and he squealed with sudden fright and got out of the cart as speedily as possible, his assistant tumbling out at his heels. They stood in the dusty highway before Signor Zorro, trembling with fear, the dealer begging for mercy.
"I have no money with me, kind highwayman, but I shall get it for you," the dealer cried. "I shall carry it to where you say, whenever you wish."
"Silence, beast!" Signor Zorro cried. "I do not want your money, perjurer. I know all about the farce of a trial at Reina de los Angeles. I have ways of finding out about such things speedily." "So the aged Fray swindled you, eh? Liar and thief! 'Tis you who are the swindler. And they gave that old and godly man 15 lashes across his bare back because of the lies you told. And you and the magistrado will divide the money of which you swindled him."
"I swear by the saints—"
"Do not! You have done enough false swearing already. Step forward." The dealer complied, trembling as if with a disease, and Signor Zorro dismounted swiftly and walked around in front of his horse. The dealer's assistant was standing beside the carreta, and his face was white. "Forward!" Signor Zorro commanded again. Again the dealer complied, but suddenly he began to beg for mercy, for Signor Zorro had taken a mule whip from beneath his long cloak, and held it ready in his right hand while he held the pistol in his left. "Turn your back," he commanded now.
"Mercy, good highwayman, am I to be beaten as well as robbed? You would whip an honest merchant because of a thieving fray?"
The first blow fell, and the dealer shrieked with pain. His last remark appeared to have given strength to the highwayman's arm. The second blow fell, and the dealer in hides and tallow went to his knees in the dusty highroad. Then Signor Zorro returned his pistol to his belt, and stepped forward and grasped the dealer's mop of hair with his left hand, so as to hold him up. And with the right he rained heavy blows with the mule whip upon the man's back, until his tough coat and shirt were cut to ribbons, and the blood soaked through.
"That for a man who perjures himself and has an honest fray punished!"
Signor Zorro cried. And then he gave his attention to the assistant. "No doubt, young man, you but carried out your master's orders when you lied before the magistrado," he said. "But you must be taught to be honest and fair, no matter what the circumstances."
"Mercy, signor!"
the assistant howled.
"Did you not laugh when a fray was being whipped? Are you not filled with wine now because you have been celebrating the punishment that godly man received for something he did not do?"
Signor Zorro grasped the youth by the nape of his neck, whirled him around, and sent a stiff blow at his shoulders. The boy shrieked, and then began whimpering. 5 lashes in all he received, for Signor Zorro apparently did not wish to render him unconscious, and finally he hurled the boy from him and looped his whip. "Let us hope both of you have learned your lesson," he said. "Get into the carreta and drive on. And when you speak of this occurrence, tell the truth, else I hear of it and punish you again. Let me not learn that you have said some 15 or 20 men surrounded and held you while I worked with the whip." The apprentice sprang into the cart, and his master followed, and they whipped up and disappeared in a cloud of dust towards San Gabriel. Signor Zorro looked after them for a time, then lifted his mask and wiped the perspiration from his face, and then mounted his horse again, fastening the mule whip to the pommel of his saddle. Chapter 23. More Punishment. Signor Zorro rode quickly to the crest of the hill beneath which was the pueblo, and there he stopped his horse and looked down at the village. It was almost dark, but he could see quite well enough for his purpose. Candles had been lighted in the tavern, and from the building came the sounds of raucous song and loud jest. Candles were burning at the Presidio, and from some of the houses came the odour of cooking food. Signor Zorro rode on down the hill. When he reached the edge of the plaza he put spurs to his horse and dashed up to the tavern door, before which half a dozen men were congregated, the most of them under the influence of wine. "Landlord!" he cried. None of the men about the door gave him particular attention at first, thinking he was but some caballero on a journey wishing refreshment. The landlord hurried out, rubbing his fat hands together, and stepped close to the horse, and then he saw that the rider was masked, and that the muzzle of a pistol was threatening him. "Is the magistrado within?" Signor Zorro asked. Si, signor." "Stand where you are and pass the word for him. Say there is a caballero here who wishes speech with him regarding a certain matter." The terrified landlord shrieked for the magistrado, and the word was passed inside. Presently the judge came staggering out, crying in a loud voice to know who had summoned him from his pleasant entertainment. He staggered up to the horse and put one hand against it, and looked up to find two glittering eyes regarding him through a mask. He opened his mouth to shriek, but Signor Zorro warned him in time. "Not a sound, or you die," he said. "I have come to punish you. Today you passed judgment on a godly man who was innocent. Moreover, you knew of his innocence, and the trial was but a farce. By your order he received a certain number of lashes. You shall have the same payment." "You dare—" "Silence!" the highwayman commanded. "You about the door there, come to my side," he called. They crowded forward, the most of them peons, who thought that here was a caballero who wished something done, and had gold to pay for it. In the dusk they did not see the mask and pistol until they stood beside the horse, and it was too late to retreat then. "We are going to punish this unjust magistrado," Signor Zorro told them. "The 5 of you will seize him now, and conduct him to the post in the middle of the plaza, and there you will tie him. The first man to falter receives a slug of lead from my pistol, and my blade will deal with the others. And I wish speed also." The frightened magistrado began to screech now. "Laugh loudly, that his cries may not be heard," the highwayman ordered, and the men laughed as loudly as they could, albeit there was a peculiar quality to their laughter. They seized the magistrado by the arms and conducted him to the post, and bound him there with thongs. "You will line up," Signor Zorro told them. "You will take this whip, and each of you will lash this man 5 times. I shall be watching, and if I see the whip fall lightly once, I shall deal out punishment. Begin!" He tossed the whip to the first man, and the punishment began. Signor Zorro had no fault to find with the manner in which it was given, for there was great fear in the hearts of the peons, and they whipped with strength and willingly. "You also, landlord," Signor Zorro said. "You will put me in carcel for it afterward," the landlord wailed. "Do you prefer carcel or a coffin, signor?" the highwayman asked. It became evident that the landlord preferred the carcel. He picked up the whip, and he surpassed the peons in the strength of his blows. The magistrado was hanging heavily from the thongs now. Unconsciousness had come to him with about the 15th blow, more through fear than through pain and punishment. "Unfasten the man," the highwayman ordered. 2 men sprang forward to do his bidding. Carry him to his house, Senor Zorro went on, and tell the people of the pueblo that this is the manner in which Senor Zorro punishes those who oppress the poor and helpless, who give unjust verdicts and who steal in the name of the law. Go your ways. The magistrado was carried away, groaning, consciousness returning to him now. Senor Zorro turned once more to the landlord. We shall return to the tavern, he said. You will go inside and fetch me a mug of wine, and stand beside my horse while I drink it. It would be only a waste of breath for me to say what will happen to you if you attempt treachery on the way. But there was fear of the magistrado in the landlord's heart as great as his fear of Senor Zorro. He went back to the tavern beside the highwayman's horse, and he hurried inside as if to get the wine. But he sounded the alarm. "Senor Zorro is without!" He hissed at those nearest the table. "He has just caused the magistrado to be whipped cruelly. He has sent me to get him a mug of wine." Then he went on to the wine cask and began drawing the drink slowly as possible. There was sudden activity inside the tavern. Some half-dozen caballeros were there, men who followed in the footsteps of the governor. Now they drew their blades and began creeping toward the door, and one of them who possessed a pistol and had it in his sash drew it out, saw that it was prepared for work, and followed in their wake. Senor Zorro, sitting his horse some 20 feet from the door of the tavern, suddenly beheld a throng rush out at him, saw the light flash from half a dozen blades, heard the report of a pistol, and heard a ball whistle past his head. The landlord was standing in the doorway, praying that the highwayman would be captured, for then he would be given some credit, and perhaps the magistrado would not punish him for having used the lash. Senor Zorro caused his horse to rear high in the air, and then raked the beast with the spurs. The animal sprang forward into the midst of the caballeros, scattering them. That was what Senor Zorro wanted. His blade already was out of its scabbard, and it passed through a man's sword arm, swung over and drew blood on another. He fenced like a maniac, maneuvering his horse to keep his antagonists separated, so that only one could get at him at a time. Now the air was filled with shrieks and cries, and men came tumbling from the houses to ascertain the cause of the commotion. Senor Zorro knew that some of them would have pistols, and while he feared no blade, he realized that a man could stand some distance away and cut him down with a pistol ball. So he caused his horse to plunge forward again, and before the fat landlord realized it, Senor Zorro was beside him, and had reached down and grasped him by the arm. The horse darted away, the fat landlord dragging, shrieking for rescue and begging for mercy in the same breath. Senor Zorro rode with him to the whipping post. "Hand me that whip," he commanded. The shrieking landlord obeyed, and called upon the saints to protect him. And then Senor Zorro turned him loose, and curled the whip around his fat middle. And as the landlord tried to run, he cut at him again and again. He left him once to charge down upon those who had blades and so scatter them, and then he was back with the landlord again, applying the whip. "You tried treachery," he cried. "Dog of a thief! You would send men about my ears, eh? I'll strip your tough hide." "Mercy!" the landlord shrieked and fell to the ground. Senor Zorro cut at him again, bringing forth a yell more than blood. He wheeled his horse and darted at the nearest of his foes. Another pistol ball whistled past his head. Another man sprang at him with blade ready. Senor Zorro ran the man neatly through the shoulder and put spurs to his horse again. He galloped as far as the whipping post, and there he stopped his horse and faced them for an instant. "There are not enough of you to make a fight interesting, senores," he cried. He swept off his sombrero and bowed to them in nice mockery, and then he wheeled his horse again and dashed away. Chapter 24. At the Hacienda of Don Alejandro. Behind him he left a tumult in the town. The shrieks of the fat landlord had aroused the pueblo. Men came running, servants hurrying at their sides and carrying torches. Women peered from the windows of the houses. Natives stood still wherever they happened to be, and shivered, for it had been their dear experience that Whenever there was a tumult, natives paid the price. Many young caballeros of hot blood were there, and for some time there had been no excitement in the pueblo of Reina de los Angeles. These young men crowded into the tavern and listened to the wails of the landlord, and some hurried to the house of the magistrado and saw his wounds, and heard him declaim on the indignity that had been offered the law, and therefore his excellency the governor. Captain Ramon came down from the Presidio, and when he heard the cause of the tumult he swore great oaths, and sent his only well man to ride along the Pala road, overtake Sergeant Gonzales and his troopers, and bid them return and take the trail, since at the time being they were following a false scent. But the young caballeros saw in this circumstance a chance for excitement that was to their liking, and they asked permission of the Commandante to form a posse and take after the highwayman, a permission they received immediately. Some 30 of them mounted horses, looked to weapons, and set out, with the intention of dividing into 3 bands of 10 each when they came to forks in the trail. The townsmen cheered them as they started, and they galloped rapidly up the hill and toward the San Gabriel road, making a deal of noise, glad that now there was a moon to let them see the foe when they approached him. In time they separated, 10 going toward San Gabriel proper, 10 taking the trail that led to the hacienda of Fray Felipe, and the last 10 following a road that curved down the valley to the neighborhood of a series of landed estates owned by wealthy dons of the day. Along this road Don Diego Vega had ridden some time before, the deaf and dumb Bernardo behind him on the mule. Don Diego rode with leisure, and it was long after nightfall when he turned from the main road and followed a narrower one toward his father's house. Don Alejandro Vega, the head of the family, sat alone at his table, the remains of the evening meal before him, when he heard a horseman before the door. A servant ran to open it, and Don Diego entered, Bernardo following close behind him. "Ah, Diego, my son!" the old Don cried, extending his arms. Don Diego was clasped for an instant to his father's breast, and then he sat down beside the table and grasped a mug of wine. Having refreshed himself, he faced Don Alejandro once more. "It has been a fatiguing journey," he remarked. "And the cause for it, my son?" "I felt that I should come to the hacienda," Don Diego said. "It is no time to be in the pueblo. Wherever a man turns he finds naught but violence and bloodshed. This confounded Señor Zorro—" "Ha! What of him?" "Please do not ha me, sir and father. I have been ha'd at from morning until night these several days. These be turbulent times. This Señor Zorro has made a visit to the Pulido hacienda and frightened everyone there. I went to my hacienda on business, and from there I went over to see old Fray Felipe, thinking I might get a chance to meditate in his presence. And who makes an appearance but a big sergeant and his troopers seeking this Señor Zorro?" "They caught him?" "I believe not, sir and father. I returned to the pueblo, and what think you happened there this day? They brought in Fray Felipe, accused of having swindled a dealer, and after a mockery of a trial they lashed him to a post and gave him the whip 15 times across his back." "The scoundrels!" Don Alejandro cried. "I could stand it no longer, and so I decided to pay you a visit. Wherever I turn there is turmoil. It is enough to make a man insane. You may ask Bernardo if it is not." Don Alejandro glanced at the deaf and dumb native and grinned. Bernardo grinned back as a matter of course, not knowing it was no manner in which to act in the presence of a don. "You have something else to tell me?" Don Alejandro asked his son, looking at him searchingly. "By the saints, now it comes. I had hoped to avoid it, father and sir." "Let me hear about it." "I paid a visit to the Pulido hacienda, and spoke with Don Carlos and his wife, also the Señorita Lolita." "You were pleased with the señorita?" "She is as lovely as any girl of my acquaintance." Don Diego said. "I spoke to Don Carlos of the matter of marriage, and he appeared to be delighted."
"Ah, he would be," said Don Alejandro.
"But the marriage cannot take place, I fear."
"How is this? There is some shadow concerning the señorita?"
"Not to my knowledge. She appears to be a sweet and innocent maiden, father and sir. I had them come to Reina de los Angeles and spend a couple of days at my house. I had it arranged so that she could see the furnishings and learn of my wealth."
"That was a wise arrangement, my son."
"But she will have none of me."
"How is this? Refuses to wed with a Vega? Refuses to become allied to the most powerful family in the country, with the best blood in the land?"
"She intimated, father and sir, that I am not the sort of man for her. She is prone to foolishness, I believe. She would have me play a guitar under her window, perhaps, and make eyes and hold hands when her duenna is not looking, and all that silliness."
"By the saints, are you a Vega?" Don Alejandro cried. "Would not any worthy man want a chance like that? Would not any caballero delight to serenade his love on a moonlight night? The little things you term silly are the very essence of love. I doubt not the señorita was displeased with you."
"But I did not see that such things were necessary," Don Diego said.
"Did you go to the señorita in a cold-blooded manner and suggest that you wed and have it done with? Had you the idea, young sir, that you were purchasing a horse or a bull? By the saints! And so there is no chance for you to wed the girl? She has the best blood by far next to our own."
"Don Carlos bade me have hope," Diego replied. "He took her back to the hacienda, and suggested that perhaps when she had been there a time and had reflected, she might change her mind."
"She is yours if you play the game," Don Alejandro said. "You are a Vega, and therefore the best catch in the country. Be but half a lover, and the señorita is yours. What sort of blood is in your veins? I have half a mind to slit one of them and see."
"Cannot we allow this marriage business to drop for the time being?" Don Diego asked.
"You are 25. I was quite old when you were born. Soon I shall go the way of my fathers. You are the only son, the heir, and you must have a wife and offspring. Is the Vega family to die out because your blood is water? Win you a wife within the quarter year, young sir, and a wife I can accept into the family, or I leave my wealth to the Franciscans when I pass away."
"My father—"
"I mean it. Get life into you. I would you had half the courage and spirit this Señor Zorro, this highwayman, has. He has principles, and he fights for them. He aids the helpless and avenges the oppressed. I salute him. I would rather have you, my son, in his place, running the risk of death or imprisonment, than to have you a lifeless dreamer of dreams that amount to naught."
"My father, I have been a dutiful son."
"I would you had been a little wild. It would have been more natural," Don Alejandro sighed. "I could overlook a few escapades more easily than I can lifelessness. Arouse yourself, young sir. Remember that you are a Vega. When I was your age, I was not a laughing stock. I was ready to fight at a wink, to make love to every pair of flashing eyes, to stand up to any caballero in sports rough or refined. Ha!"
"I pray you do not ha me, sir and father. My nerves are on an edge."
"You must be more of a man."
"I shall attempt it immediately," Don Diego said, straightening himself somewhat in his chair. "I had hoped to avoid it, but it appears that I cannot. I shall woo the Señorita Lolita as other men woo maidens. You meant what you said about your fortune?"
"I did," said Don Alejandro.
"Then I must bestir myself. It would never do, of course, to let that fortune go out of the family. I shall think these matters over in peace and quiet tonight. Perhaps I can meditate here, far from the pueblo. By the saints!" This last exclamation was caused by a sudden tumult outside the house. Don Alejandro and his son heard a number of horsemen stop, heard their calls to one another, heard bridles jingling and blades rattling. "There is no peace in all the world," Don Diego said, with deepened gloom.
"It sounds like half a score of men,"
Don Alejandro said. It was, exactly. A servant opened the door, and into the great room there strode 10 caballeros, with blades at their sides and pistols in their belts.
"Ha! Don Alejandro, we crave hospitality," the foremost cried. "You have it without asking, caballeros. What manner of journey is this you take?" "We pursue Señor Zorro, the highwayman."
"By the saints!" Don Diego cried. "One cannot escape it even here. Violence and bloodshed."
"He invaded the plaza at Reina de los Angeles," the spokesman went on. "He had the magistrado whipped because he sentenced Fray Felipe to receive the lash, and he whipped the fat landlord, and he fought half a score of men while he was about it. Then he rode away, and we made up a band to pursue him. He has not been in this neighbourhood?"
"Not to my knowledge," Don Alejandro said. "My son arrived off the highway but a short time ago."
"You did not see the fellow, Don Diego?"
"I did not," Don Diego said. "That is one stroke of good fortune that came my way." Don Alejandro had sent for servants, and now wine mugs were on the long table, and heaps of small cakes, and the caballeros began to eat and drink. Don Diego knew well what that meant. Their pursuit of the highwayman was at an end; their enthusiasm had waned. They would sit at his father's table and drink throughout the night, gradually getting intoxicated, shout and sing and tell stories, and in the morning ride back to Reina de los Angeles like so many heroes. It was the custom. The chase of Señor Zorro was but a pretext for a merry time. The servants brought great stone jugs filled with rare wine, and put them on the table, and Don Alejandro ordered that meat be fetched also. The young caballeros had a weakness for these parties at Don Alejandro's, for the Don's good wife had been dead for several years, and there were no women folk except servants, and so they could make what noise they pleased throughout the night. In time they put aside pistols and blades, and began to boast and brag, and Don Alejandro had his servants put the weapons in a far corner out of the way, for he did not wish a drunken quarrel with a dead caballero or two in his house. Don Diego drank and talked with them for a time, and then sat to one side and listened, as if such foolishness bored him.
"It were well for the Señor Zorro that we did not catch up with him," one cried. "Any one of us is a match for the fellow. Were the soldiers men of merit, he would have been taken long before this." "Ha! For a chance at him," another screeched. "How the landlord did howl when he was whipped." "He rode in this direction?" Don Alejandro asked. "We are not sure as to that. He took the San Gabriel trail. 30 of us followed. We separated into 3 bands, each going a different direction. It is the good fortune of one of the other bands to have him now, I suppose, but it is our excellent good fortune to be here."
Don Diego stood before the company. "Signores, you will pardon me, I know, if I retire," he said. "I am fatigued with the journey."
"Retire by all means," one of his friends cried, "and when you are rested, come out to us again and make merry."
They laughed at that, and Don Diego bowed ceremoniously, and observed that several scarcely could get to their feet to bow in return, and then the scion of the house of Vega hurried from the room with the deaf and dumb man at his heels. He entered a room that always was ready for him, and in which a candle already was burning, and closed the door behind him, and Bernardo stretched his big form on the floor just outside it, to guard his master during the night. In the great living room Don Diego scarcely was missed. His father was frowning and twisting his moustache, for he would have had his son like other young men. In his youth, he was remembering, he never left such a company early in the evening. And once again he sighed and wished that the saints had given him a son with red blood in his veins. The caballeros were singing now, joining in the chorus of a popular love song, and their discordant voices filled the big room. Don Alejandro smiled as he listened, for it brought his own youth back to him. They sprawled on chairs and benches on both sides of the long table, pounding it with their mugs as they sang, laughing boisterously now and then.
"Were this Señor Zorro only here now!" one of them cried.
A voice from the doorway answered him.
"Señores, he is here."
Chapter 25. A League is Formed. The song ceased. The laughter was stilled. They blinked their eyes and looked across the room. Señor Zorro stood just inside the door, having entered from the veranda without them knowing it. He wore his long cloak and his mask, and in one hand he held his accursed pistol, and its muzzle was pointed at the table.
"So, these are the manner of men who pursue Señor Zorro and hope to take him," he said. "Make not a move, else lead flies. Your weapons, I perceive, are in the corner. I could kill some of you and be gone before you could reach them."
"'Tis he! 'Tis he!"
a tipsy caballero was crying.
"Your noise may be heard a mile away, señores. What a posse to go pursuing a man! Is this the way you attend to duty? Why have you stopped to make merry while Señor Zorro rides the highway?"
"Give me my blade and let me stand before him," one cried.
"If I allowed you to have blade, you would be unable to stand,"
the highwayman answered.
"Think you there is one in this company who could fence with me now?"
"There is one,"
cried Don Alejandro in a loud voice, springing to his feet.
"I openly say that I have admired some of the things that you have done, señor, but now that you have entered my house and are abusing my guests, I must call you to account."
"I have no quarrel with you, Don Alejandro, and you have none with me," Señor Zorro said. "I refuse to cross blades with you, and I am but telling these men some truths."
"By the saints, I shall make you."
"A moment, Don Alejandro. Señores, this aged Don would fight me, and that would mean a wound or death for him. Will you allow it?"
"Don Alejandro must not fight our battles,"
one of them cried.
"Then see that he sits in his place, and all honour to him."
Don Alejandro started forward, but two of the caballeros sprang before him and urged him to go back, saying that his honour was safe, since he offered combat. Raging, Don Alejandro complied.
"A worthy bunch of young blades," Señor Zorro sneered. "You drink wine and make merry while injustice is all about you. Take your swords in hand and attack oppression. Live up to your noble names and your blue blood, señores. Drive the thieving politicians from the land. Protect the frailes whose work gave us these broad acres. Be men, not drunken fashion plates."
"By the saints!"
one cried, and sprang to his feet.
"Back, or I fire! I have not come to fight you in Don Alejandro's house. I respect him too much for that. I have come to tell you these truths concerning yourselves. Your families can make or break a governor. Band yourselves together in a good cause, caballeros, and make some use of your lives. You would do it were you not afraid. You seek adventure? Here is adventure aplenty, fighting injustice."
"By the saints, it would be a lark,"
cried one in answer.
"Look upon it as a lark, if it pleases you, yet you would be doing some good. Would the politicians dare stand against you, scions of the most powerful families? Band yourselves together and give yourselves a name. Make yourselves feared the length and breadth of the land." "It would be treason." "It is not treason to down a tyrant, caballeros. Is it that you are afraid?"
"By the saints, no!"
they cried in chorus.
"Then make your stand."
"You would lead us?"
"Si, señores."
"But stay, are you of good blood?"
"I am a caballero, of blood as good as any here,"
Señor Zorro told them.
"Your name? Where resides your family?"
"These things must remain secrets for the present. I have given you my word."
Your face must remain masked for the time being, señores." They had lurched to their feet now and were acclaiming him wildly.
"Stay!" one cried. "This is an imposition upon Don Alejandro. He may not be in sympathy, and we are planning and plotting in his house."
"I am in sympathy, caballeros, and give you my support," Don Alejandro said. Their cheers filled the great room. None could stand against them if Don Alejandro Vega was with them. Not even the governor himself would dare oppose them.
"It is a bargain," they cried. "We shall call ourselves the Avengers. We shall ride El Camino Real and prove terrors to those who rob honest men and mistreat natives. We shall drive the thieving politicians out."
"And then you shall be caballeros in truth, knights protecting the weak," Señor Zorro said. "Never shall you repent this decision, señores. I lead, and I give you loyalty and expect as much. Also, I expect obedience to orders."
"What shall we do?" they cried.
"Let this remain a secret. In the morning, return to Reina de los Angeles and say that you did not find Señor Zorro. Say rather that you did not catch him, which will be the truth. Be ready to band yourselves together and ride. I shall send word when the time arrives."
"In what manner?"
"I know you all. I shall get word to one, and he can inform the others. It is agreed?"
"Agreed!"
they shouted. "Then I will leave you here and now. You are to remain in this room, and none is to try to follow me. It is a command. Buenas noches, caballeros." He bowed before them, swung the door open and darted through it, and slammed it shut behind him. They could hear the clatter of a horse's hoofs on the driveway. And then they raised their wine mugs and drank to their new league for the suppression of swindlers and thieves, and to Señor Zorro, the curse of Capistrano, and to Don Alejandro Vega, somewhat sobered by the agreement they had made and what it meant. They sat down again, and began speaking of wrongs that should be righted, each of them knowing half a dozen. And Don Alejandro Vega sat in one corner, by himself, a grief-stricken man, because his only son was asleep in the house and had not red blood enough to take a part in such an undertaking, when by all rights he should be one of the leaders. As if to add to his misery, Don Diego at that moment came slowly into the room, rubbing his eyes and yawning, and looking as if he had been disturbed.
"It is impossible for a man to sleep in this house tonight," he said. "Give me a mug of wine, and I shall take my place with you. Why was the cheering?"
"Señor Zorro has been here," his father began.
"The highwayman been here? By the saints, it is as much as a man can endure."
"Sit down, my son," Don Alejandro urged. "Certain things have come to pass. There will be a chance now for you to show what sort of blood flows in your veins." Don Alejandro's manner was very determined. Chapter 26. An Understanding. The remainder of the night was spent by the caballeros in loud boasts of what they intended doing, and in making plans to be submitted to Señor Zorro for his approval. And, though they appeared to look upon this thing as a lark and a means to adventure, yet there was an undercurrent of seriousness in their manner. For they knew well the state of the times, and realized that things were not as they should be, and in reality they were exponents of fairness to all. They had thought of these things often, but had made no move because they had not been banded together and had no leader, and each young caballero waited for another to start the thing. But now this Señor Zorro had struck at the psychological moment, and things could be done. Don Diego was informed of the state of affairs, and his father informed him, likewise, that he was to play a part and prove himself a man. Don Diego fumed considerably, and declared that such a thing would cause his death, yet he would do it for his father's sake. Early in the morning the caballeros ate a meal that Don Alejandro caused to be prepared, and then they started back to Reina de los Angeles, Don Diego riding with them at his father's order. Nothing was to be said about their plans. They were to get recruits from the remainder of the 30 who had set out in pursuit of Señor Zorro.
Some would join them readily, they knew, while others were the governor's men pure and simple, and would have to be kept in the dark concerning the thing contemplated. They rode leisurely, for which Don Diego remarked that he was grateful. Bernardo was still following him on the mule, and was a little chagrined because Don Diego had not remained longer at his father's house. Bernardo knew something momentous was being planned, but could not guess what, of course, and wished that he was like other men, and could hear and speak. When they reached the plaza, they found that the other two parties already were there, saying that they had not come up with the highwayman. Some declared that they had seen him in the distance, and one that he had fired a pistol at him, at which the caballeros who had been at Don Alejandro's put their tongues in their cheeks and looked at one another in a peculiar manner. Don Diego left his companions and hurried to his house, where he donned fresh clothing and refreshed himself generally. He sent Bernardo about his business, which was to sit in the kitchen and await his master's call, and then he ordered his carriage around. That carriage was one of the most gorgeous along El Camino Real, and why Don Diego had purchased it had always been a mystery. There were some who said he did it to show his wealth, while others declared a manufacturer's agent had worried him so much that Don Diego had given him the order to be rid of him. Don Diego came from his house dressed in his best, but he did not get into the carriage. Again there was a tumult in the plaza, and into it rode Sergeant Pedro Gonzalez and his troopers. The man Captain Ramon had sent after them had overtaken them easily, for they had been riding slowly and had not covered many miles.
"Ha, Don Diego, my friend!" Gonzalez cried. "Still living in this turbulent world?"
"From necessity," Don Diego replied. "Did you capture this Señor Zorro?"
"The pretty bird escaped us, caballero. It appears that he turned towards San Gabriel that night, while we went chasing him towards Pala. Ah, well, 'tis nothing to make a small mistake. Our revenge shall be the greater when we find him."
"What do you do now, my sergeant?"
"My men refresh themselves, and then we ride towards San Gabriel. It is said the highwayman is in that vicinity, though some 30 young men of blood failed to find him last night, after he had caused the magistrado to be whipped. No doubt he hid himself in the brush, and chuckled when the caballeros rode by."
"May your horse have speed and your sword arm strength," Don Diego said, and got into his carriage. 2 magnificent horses were hitched to the carriage, and a native coachman in rich livery drove them. Don Diego stretched back on the cushions and half closed his eyes as the carriage started. The driver went across the plaza and turned into the highway, and started toward the hacienda of Don Carlos Pulido. Sitting on his veranda, Don Carlos saw the gorgeous carriage approaching, and growled low down in his throat, and then got up and hurried into the house to face his wife and daughter.
"Señorita, Don Diego comes," he said.
"I have spoken words regarding the young man, and I trust that you have given heed to them as a dutiful daughter should." Then he turned and went out to the veranda again, and the señorita rushed into her room, and threw herself upon a couch to weep. The saints knew she wished that she could feel some love for Don Diego, and take him for a husband, for it would help her father's fortunes, yet she felt that she could not. Why did not the man act the caballero? Why did he not exhibit a certain measure of common sense? Why did he not show that he was a young man bursting with health, instead of acting like an aged don with one foot in the grave? Don Diego got from the carriage and waved to the driver to continue to the stable yard. He greeted Don Carlos languidly, and Don Carlos was surprised to note that Don Diego had a guitar beneath one arm. He put the guitar down on the floor, removed his sombrero, and sighed. "I have been out to see my father," he said.
"Ah, Don Alejandro is well, I hope."
"He is in excellent health, as usual. He has instructed me to persist in my suit for the Señorita Lolita's hand. If I do not win me a wife within a certain time, he says, he will give his fortune to the Franciscans when he passes away."
"Indeed?"
"He said it,
and my father is not a man to waste his words. Don Carlos, I must win the señorita. I know of no other young woman who would be acceptable to my father as a daughter-in-law." "A little wooing, Don Diego, I beg of you. Be not so matter-of-fact, I pray." "I have decided to woo as other men, though it no doubt will be much of a bore. How would you suggest that I start?" "It is difficult to give advice in such a case," Don Carlos replied, trying desperately to remember how he had done it when he had courted Dona Catalina. "A man really should be experienced, else a man to whom such things come naturally." "I fear I am neither," Don Diego said, sighing again and raising tired eyes to Don Carlos's face. "It might be an excellent thing to regard the señorita as if you adored her. Say nothing about marriage at first, but speak rather of love. Try to talk in low, rich tones, and say those meaningless nothings in which a young woman can find a world of meaning. 'Tis a gentle art, saying one thing and meaning another." "I fear that is beyond me," Don Diego said. "Yet I must try, of course. I may see the señorita now?" Don Carlos went to the doorway and called his wife and daughter, and the former smiled upon Don Diego in encouragement, and the latter smiled also, yet with fear and trembling. For she had given her heart to the unknown Señor Zorro, and could love no other man, and could not wed where she did not love, not even to save her father from poverty. Don Diego conducted the señorita to a bench at one end of the veranda, and started to talk of things in general, plucking at the strings of his guitar as he did so, while Don Carlos and his wife removed themselves to the other end of the veranda and hoped that things would go well. Señorita Lolita was glad that Don Diego did not speak of marriage as he had done before. Instead, he told of what had happened in the pueblo, of Fray Felipe's whipping, and of how Señor Zorro had punished the magistrado, and fought a dozen men, and made his escape. Despite his air of languor, Don Diego spoke in an interesting manner, and the señorita found herself liking him more than before. He told, too, of how he had gone to his father's hacienda, and of how the caballeros had spent the night there, drinking and making merry. But he said nothing of Señor Zorro's visit, and the league that had been formed, having taken his oath not to do so. "My father threatens to disinherit me if I do not get me a wife within a specified time," Don Diego said then. "Would you like to see me lose my father's estate, señorita?" "Certainly not," she replied. "There are many girls who would be proud to wed you, Don Diego." "But not you?" "Certainly I would be proud. But can a girl help it if her heart does not speak? Would you wish a wife who did not love you? Think of the long years you would have to spend beside her, and no love to make them endurable." "You do not think, then, that you could ever learn to love me, señorita?" Suddenly the girl faced him and spoke in lower tones and earnestly. "You are a caballero of the blood, señor. I may trust you?" "To death, señorita." "Then I have something to tell you, and I ask that you let it remain your secret. It is an explanation, in a way." "Proceed, señorita." "If my heart bade me do so, nothing would please me more than to become your wife, señor, for I know that it would mend my father's fortunes. But perhaps I am too honest to wed where I do not love. There is one great reason why I cannot love you." "There is some other man in your heart?" "You have guessed it, señor. My heart is filled with his image. You would not want me for wife in such a case. My parents do not know. You must keep my secret. I swear by the saints that I have spoken the truth." "The man is worthy?" "I feel sure that he is, caballero. Did he prove to be otherwise, I should grieve my life away, yet I could never love another man. You understand now?" I understand fully, señorita. May I express the hope that you will find him worthy, and in time, the man of your choice?
I knew you would be the true caballero. And if things should go amiss and you need a friend, command me, señorita.
My father must not suspect at the present time. We must let him think that you still seek me, and I will pretend to be thinking more of you than before, and gradually you will cease your visits.
I understand, señorita. Yet that leaves me in bad case. I have asked your father for permission to woo you, and if I go to wooing another girl now, I will have him about my ears in just anger. And if I do not woo another girl, I shall have my own father upbraiding me. It is a sorry state.
Perhaps it will not be for long, señor.
Ha! I have it! What does a man do when he is disappointed in love? He mopes, he pulls a long face, he refuses to partake of the actions and excitements of the times. Señorita, you have saved me in a way. I shall languish because you do not return my love. Then men will think they know the reason when I dream in the sun and meditate instead of riding and fighting like a fool. I shall be allowed to go my way in peace, and there shall be a romantic glamour cast about me. An excellent thought.
Señor, you are incorrigible, the Señorita Lolita exclaimed, laughing.
Don Carlos and Dona Catalina heard that laugh, looked around, and then exchanged quick glances. Don Diego Vega was getting along famously with the señorita, they thought. Then Don Diego continued the deception by playing his guitar and singing a verse of a song that had to do with bright eyes and love. Don Carlos and his wife glanced at each other again, this time in apprehension, and wished that he would stop, for the scion of the Vegas had many superiors as musician and vocalist, and they feared that he might lose what ground he had gained in the señorita's estimation. But if Lolita thought little of the caballero's singing, she said nothing to that effect, and she did not act displeased. There was some more conversation, and just before the siesta hour, Don Diego bade them buenos dias and rode away in his gorgeous carriage. From the turn in the driveway, he waved back at them. Chapter 27. Orders for Arrest. Captain Ramon's courier, sent north with a letter for the governor, had dreams of gay times in San Francisco de Asís before returning to his presidio at Reina de los Angeles. He knew a certain señorita there whose beauty caused his heart to burn. So he rode like a fiend after leaving his comandante's office, changed mounts at San Fernando and at a hacienda along the way, and galloped into Santa Barbara a certain evening just at dusk, with the intention of changing horses again, getting meat and bread and wine at the presidio, and rushing on his way. And at Santa Barbara his hopes of basking in the señorita's smiles at San Francisco de Asís were cruelly shattered, for before the door of the presidio there was a gorgeous carriage that made Don Diego's appear like a carreta, and a score of horses were tethered there, and more troopers than were stationed at Santa Barbara regularly moved about the highway, laughing and jesting with one another. The governor was in Santa Barbara. His Excellency had left San Francisco de Asís some days before on a trip of inspection, and intended to go as far south as San Diego de Acala, strengthening his political fences, rewarding his friends, and awarding punishment to his enemies. He had reached Santa Barbara an hour before, and was listening to the report of the commandante there, after which he intended remaining during the night with a friend. His troopers were to be given quarters at the presidio, of course, and the journey was to continue on the morrow. Captain Ramon's courier had been told that the letter he carried was of the utmost importance, and so he hurried to the office of the commandante and entered it like a man of rank. "I come from Captain Ramon, commandante at Reina de los Angeles, with a letter of importance for His Excellency," he reported, standing stiffly at salute. The governor grunted and took the letter, and the commandante motioned for the courier to withdraw. His Excellency read the letter with speed, and when he had finished there was an unholy gleam in his eyes, and he twirled his moustache with every evidence of keen satisfaction. And then he read the letter again, and frowned. He liked the thought that he could crush Don Carlos Pulido more, but he disliked to think that Señor Zorro, the man who had affronted him, was still at liberty. He got up and paced the floor for a time, and then whirled upon the Comandante. "I shall leave for the south at sunrise," he said. "My presence is urgently needed at Reina de los Angeles. You will attend to things. Tell that courier he shall ride back with my escort. I go now to the house of my friend." And so in the morning the governor started south, his escort of 20 picked troopers surrounding him, the courier in their midst. He travelled swiftly, and on a certain day, at mid-morning, entered the plaza of Reina de los Angeles unheralded. It was the same morning that Don Diego rode to the Pulido hacienda in his carriage, taking his guitar with him. The cavalcade stopped before the tavern, and the fat landlord almost suffered an apoplexy because he had not been warned of the governor's coming, and was afraid he would enter the inn and find it in a dirty state. But the governor made no effort to leave his carriage and enter the tavern. He was glancing around the square, observing many things. He never felt secure concerning the men of rank in this pueblo. He felt that he did not have the proper grip on them. Now he watched carefully as news of his arrival was spread, and certain caballeros hurried to the plaza to greet him and make him welcome. He noted those who appeared to be sincere, observed those who were in no particular haste to salute him, and noticed that several were absent. Business must receive his first attention, he told them, and he must hasten up to the Presidio. After that he would gladly be the guest of any of them. He accepted an invitation, and ordered his driver to proceed. He was remembering Captain Ramon's letter, and he had not seen Don Diego Vega in the plaza. Sergeant Gonzales and his men were away pursuing Señor Zorro, of course, and so Captain Ramon himself was awaiting his Excellency at the Presidio entrance, and saluted him gravely, and bowed low before him, and ordered the commander of the escort to take charge of the place and police it, stationing guards in honour of the governor. He led his Excellency to the private office, and the governor sat down. "What is the latest news?" he asked. "My men are on the trail, Excellency, but, as I wrote, this pest of a Señor Zorro has friends, a legion of them, I take it. My sergeant has reported that twice he found him with a band of followers." "They must be broken up, killed off," the governor cried. "A man of that sort always can get followers and yet more followers, until he will be so strong that he can cause us serious trouble. Has he committed any further atrocities?" "He has, Excellency. Yesterday a fray from San Gabriel was whipped for swindling. Señor Zorro caught the witnesses against him on the high road, and whipped them almost to death. And then he rode into the pueblo just at dusk and had the magistrado whipped. My soldiers were away looking for him at the time. It appears that this Señor Zorro knows the movements of my force, and always strikes where the troopers are not." "Then spies are giving him warnings?" "It appears so, Excellency. Last night some 30 young caballeros rode after him, but did not find track of the scoundrel. They returned this morning." "Was Don Diego Vega with them?" "He did not ride out with them, but he returned with them. It seems that they picked him up at his father's hacienda. You perhaps guessed that I meant the Vegas in my letter. I am convinced now, your Excellency, that my suspicions in that quarter were unjust. This Señor Zorro even invaded Don Diego's house one night when Don Diego was away." "How is this?" "But Don Carlos Pulido and his family were there." "Ha! In Don Diego's house. What is the meaning of that?" "It is amusing," said Captain Ramon, laughing lightly. "I have heard that Don Alejandro ordered Don Diego to get him a wife. The young man is not the sort to woo woman. He is lifeless." "I know the man. Proceed."
So he rides straight away to the hacienda of Don Carlos and asks permission to pay his addresses to Don Carlos's only daughter. Señor Zorro was abroad, and Don Diego, going to his own hacienda on business, asked Don Carlos to come to the pueblo with his family, where it would be safer, and occupy his house until he returned. The Pulidos could not refuse, of course, and Señor Zorro, it appears, followed them. Ha! Go on. It is laughable that Don Diego fetched them here to escape Señor Zorro's wrath, when in reality they are hand in glove with the highwayman. Remember, this Señor Zorro had been at the Pulido hacienda. We got word from a native, and almost caught him there. He had been eating a meal. He was hiding in a closet, and while I was alone there and my men searching the trails, he came from the closet, ran me through the shoulder from behind, and escaped. "The low scoundrel!" the governor exclaimed. "But do you think there will be a marriage between Don Diego and the Señorita Pulido?" "I imagine there would be no worry in that regard, Excellency. I am of the opinion that Don Diego's father put a flea in his ear. He probably called Don Diego's attention to the fact that Don Carlos does not stand very high with your Excellency, and that there are daughters of other men who do. At any rate, the Pulidos returned to their hacienda after Don Diego's return. Don Diego called upon me here at the Presidio, and appeared to be anxious that I would not think him a man of treason." "I am glad to hear it. The Vegas are powerful. They never have been my warm friends, yet never have they raised hands against me, so I cannot complain. It is good sense to keep them friendly, if that be possible. But these Pulidos— "Even the Señorita appears to be giving aid to this highwayman," Captain Ramon said. "She boasted to me of what she called his courage. She sneered at the soldiers. Don Carlos Pulido and some of the frailes are protecting the man, giving him food and drink, hiding him, sending him news of the troopers' whereabouts. The Pulidos are hindering our efforts to capture the rogue. I would have taken steps, but I thought it best to inform you and await your decision." "There can be but one decision in such a case," said the governor loftily. "No matter how good a man's blood may be, or what his rank, he cannot be allowed to commit treason without suffering the consequences. I had thought that Don Carlos had learned his lesson, but it appears he has not. Are any of your men in the Presidio?" "Some who are ill, Excellency." "That courier of yours returned with my escort. Does he know the country well hereabouts?" "Certainly, Excellency. He has been stationed here for some little time." "Then he can act as guide. Send half my escort at once to the hacienda of Don Carlos Pulido. Have them arrest the Don and fetch him to Carcel, and incarcerate him there. That will be a blow to his high blood. I have had quite enough of these Pulidos." "And the haughty Doña who sneered at me, and the proud Señorita who scorned the troopers?" "Ha! It is a good thought. It will teach a lesson to all in this locality. Have them fetched to Carcel and incarcerated also," the governor said. Chapter 28. The Outrage. Don Diego's carriage had just pulled up before his house when a squad of troopers went by it in a cloud of dust. He did not recognize any of them for men he had seen about the tavern. "Ha! There are new soldiers on the trail of Señor Zorro?" he asked a man standing near. "They are a part of the escort of the governor, caballero." "The governor is here?" "He arrived but a short time ago, caballero, and has gone to the Presidio." "I suppose they must have fresh news of this highwayman to send them riding furiously through dust and sun like that. He appears to be an elusive rascal. By the saints, had I been here when the governor arrived, no doubt he would have put up at my house. Now some other caballero will have the honour of entertaining him. It is much to be regretted." And then Don Diego went into the house, and the man who had heard him speak did not know whether to doubt the sincerity of that last remark. Led by the courier, who knew the way, the squad of troopers galloped swiftly along the high road,
and presently turned up the trail toward Don Carlos's house. They went at this business as they would have gone about capturing a desperado. As they struck the driveway, they scattered to left and right, tearing up Doña Catalina's flower beds and sending chickens squawking out of the way, and so surrounded the house in almost an instant of time. Don Carlos had been sitting on the veranda in his accustomed place, half in a doze, and he did not notice the advance of the troopers until he heard the beating of the horses' hoofs. He got to his feet in alarm, wondering whether Señor Zorro was in the vicinity again and the soldiers were after him. 3 dismounted in a cloud of dust before the steps, and the sergeant who commanded them made his way forward, slapping the dust from his uniform.
"You are Don Carlos Pulido?" he asked in a loud voice.
"I have that honor, señor."
"I have order to place you under military arrest."
"Arrest?" Don Carlos cried. "Who gave you such orders?"
"His Excellency the Governor. He now is in Reina de los Angeles, señor."
"And the charge?"
"Treason and aiding the enemies of the state."
"Preposterous!" Don Carlos cried. "I am accused of treason when, though the victim of oppression, I have withheld my hand against those in power? What are the particulars of the charges?"
"You will have to ask the magistrado. That, señor, I know nothing of the matter except that I am to arrest you."
"You wish me to accompany you?"
"I demand it, señor."
"I am a man of blood, a caballero."
"I have my orders."
"So I cannot be trusted to appear at my place of trial? But perhaps the hearing is to be held immediately. So much the better, for all the quicker can I clear myself. We go to the Presidio?"
"I go to the Presidio when this work is done. You go to Carcel,"
the sergeant said.
To Carcel! Don Carlos screeched. You would dare? You would throw a caballero into the filthy jail? You would place him where they keep insubordinate natives and common felons?
"I have my orders, señor. You will prepare to accompany us at once."
"I must give my superintendent instructions regarding the management of the hacienda."
"I'll go along with you, señor."
Don Carlos's face flamed purple. His hands clenched as he regarded the sergeant.
Am I to be insulted with every word? He cried. Do you think I would run away like a criminal?
"I have my orders, señor,"
the sergeant said.
At least, I may break this news to my wife and daughter without an outsider being at my shoulder?
"Your wife is Doña Catalina Pulido?"
Certainly.
"I am ordered to arrest her also, señor."
Scum! Don Carlos cried. You would put hands on a lady. You would remove her from her house?
"It is my orders. She too is charged with treason and with aiding the enemies of the state."
By the saints, it is too much. I shall fight against you and your men as long as there is breath in my body.
"And that would not be for long, Don Carlos, if you attempt to give battle. I am but carrying out my orders."
My beloved wife placed under arrest like a native wench? And on such a charge? What are you going to do with her, Sergeant?
"She goes to Carcel."
My wife in that foul place! Is there no justice in the land? She is a tender lady of noble blood.
"Enough of this, señor. My orders are my orders, and I carry them out as instructed. I am a soldier, and I obey."
Now Doña Catalina came running to the veranda, for she had been listening to the conversation just inside the door. Her face was white, but there was a look of pride in it. She feared Don Carlos might make an attack on the soldier, and she feared he would be wounded or slain if he did, and knew that at least it could only double the charge held against him.
You have heard?
Don Carlos asked.
"I have heard, my husband. It is but more persecution. I am too proud to argue the point with these common soldiers who are but doing as they have been commanded. A Pulido can be a Pulido, my husband, even in a foul carcel."
But the shame of it, Don Carlos cried. What does it all mean? Where will it end? And our daughter will be here alone with the servants. We have no relatives, no friends.
Your daughter is Señorita Lolita Pulido? The sergeant asked. Then do not grieve, señor, for you will not be separated. I have an order for the arrest of your daughter also.
The charge?
The same, señor.
And you would take her?
To Carcel.
An innocent, high-born, gentle girl.
My orders, señor,
said the sergeant. May the saints blast the man who issued them, Don Carlos cried. They have taken my wealth and lands. They have heaped shame upon me and mine. But thank the saints they cannot break our pride. And then Don Carlos's head went erect, and his eyes flashed, and he took his wife by the arm and turned about to enter the house, with the sergeant at his heels. He broke the news to the Señorita Lolita, who stood as if stricken dumb for an instant, and then burst into a torrent of tears. And then the pride of the Pulidos came to her, and she dried her eyes, and curled her pretty lips with scorn at the big sergeant, and pulled aside her skirts when he stepped near. Servants brought the carreta before the door, and Don Carlos and his wife and daughter got into it, and the journey of shame to the pueblo began. Their hearts might be bursting with grief, but not one of the Pulidos showed it. Their heads were held high, they looked straight ahead, they pretended not to hear the low taunts of the soldiers. They passed others, who were crowded off the road by the troopers, and who looked with wonder at those in the carreta, but they did not speak. Some watched in sorrow, and some grinned at their plight, according to whether those who passed were of the governor's party or of the honest folk who abhorred injustice. And so, finally, they came to the edge of Reina de los Angeles, and there they met fresh insult, for His Excellency had determined that the Pulidos should be humbled to the dust, and he had sent some of his troopers to spread news of what was being done, and to give coins to natives and peons if they would jeer the prisoners when they arrived. For the governor wished to teach a lesson that would prevent other noble families from turning against him, and wished it to appear that the Pulidos were hated by all classes alike. At the edge of the plaza they were met by the mob. There were cruel jeers and jests, some of which no innocent señorita should have heard. Don Carlos's face was red with wrath, and there were tears in Doña Catalina's eyes, and Señorita Lolita's lips were trembling, but they gave no other sign that they heard. The drive around the plaza to the carcel was made slow purposely. At the door of the inn there was a throng of rascals who had been drinking wine at the expense of the governor, and those added to the din. One man threw mud, and it splashed on Don Carlos's breast, but he refused to notice it. He had one arm around his wife, the other around his daughter, as if to give them what protection he could, and he was looking straight ahead. There were some men of blood who witnessed the scene, yet took no part in the tumult. Some of them were as old as Don Carlos, and this thing brought to their hearts fresh yet passive hatred of the governor. And some were young, with the blood running hot in their veins, and they looked upon the suffering face of Doña Catalina and imagined her their own mother, and upon the lovely face of the señorita, and imagined her their sister or betrothed. And some of these men glanced at one another furtively, and though they did not speak, they were wondering the same thing, whether Señor Zorro would hear of this, and whether he would send word around for the members of the new league to gather. The carreta stopped before the carcel finally, the mob of jeering natives and peons surrounding it. The soldiers made some pretence of holding them back, and the sergeant dismounted and forced Don Carlos and his wife and daughter to step to the ground. Uncouth and intoxicated men jostled them as they walked up the steps to the door. More mud was thrown, and some of it spattered upon Doña Catalina's gown. But if the mob expected an outburst on the part of the aged caballero, it was disappointed. Don Carlos held his head high, ignoring those who were striving to torment him, and so led his ladies to the door. The sergeant beat against it with the heavy hilt of his sword. An aperture was opened, and in it appeared the evil, grinning face of the jailer. "What have we here?" he demanded.
"3 prisoners charged with treason."
the sergeant replied. The door was thrown open. There came a last burst of jeers from the mob, and then the prisoners were inside, and the door had been closed and bolted again. The jailer led the way along an evil-smelling hall and threw open another door. "In with you," he directed. The three prisoners were thrust inside, and this door was closed and barred. They blinked their eyes in the semi-gloom. Gradually they made out two windows, some benches, some human derelicts sprawled against the walls. They had not even been given the courtesy of a clean private room. Don Carlos and his wife and daughter had been thrust in with the scum of the pueblo, with drunkards and thieves and dishonoured women and insulting natives. They sat down on a bench in one corner of the room, as far from the others as possible. And then Dona Catalina and her daughter gave way to tears, and tears streamed down the face of the aged Don as he tried to comfort them. "I would to the saints that Don Diego Vega were only my son-in-law now," the Don breathed. His daughter pressed his arm. "Perhaps, my father, a friend will come," she whispered. "Perhaps the evil man who caused this suffering will be punished." For it seemed to the señorita that a vision of Señor Zorro had appeared before her, and she had great faith in the man to whom she had given her love. Chapter 29. Don Diego Feels Ill. 1 hour after Don Carlos Pulido and his ladies had been incarcerated in the carcel, Don Diego Vega, dressed most fastidiously, made his way slowly on foot up the slope to the Presidio to make his call on His Excellency the Governor. He walked with swinging stride, gazing both to right and left as if at the hills in the distance, and once he stopped to observe a blossom that bloomed beside the path. His rapier was at his side, his most fashionable one with its jewelled hilt, and in his right hand he carried a handkerchief of flimsy lace, which he wafted this way and that like a dandy, and now and then touched it to the tip of his nose. He bowed ceremoniously to 2 or 3 caballeros who passed him, but spoke to none beyond the necessary words of greeting, and they did not seek conversation with him. For, remembering that they had thought Don Diego Vega was courting the daughter of Don Carlos, they wondered how he would take the matter of her imprisonment along with her father and mother. They did not care to discuss the matter, for their own feelings were high, and they feared they might be betrayed into utterances that might be termed treasonable. Don Diego came to the front door of the Presidio, and the sergeant in charge called the soldiers to attention, giving Vega the salute due his station in life. Don Diego answered it with a wave of his hand and a smile, and went on to the Comandante's office, where the governor was receiving such caballeros as cared to call and express their loyalty. He greeted His Excellency with carefully chosen words, bowed over his hand, and then took the chair the governor was kind enough to indicate. "Don Diego Vega," the governor said, "I am doubly glad that you have called upon me today, for in these times a man who holds high office would know his friends." "I should have called sooner, but I was away from my house at the time you arrived," Don Diego said. "You contemplate remaining long in Reina de los Angeles, Excellency?" "Until this highwayman, known as Señor Zorro, is either slain or taken," the governor said.
"By the saints, am I never to hear the last of that rogue?" Don Diego cried. "I have heard of nothing else for these many days. I go to spend an evening with a fray, and in comes a crowd of soldiers chasing this Señor Zorro. I repaired to the hacienda of my father to get me peace and quiet, and along comes a crowd of caballeros seeking news of Señor Zorro. These be turbulent times. A man whose nature inclines him to music and the poets has no right to exist in the present age."
"It desolates me that you have been annoyed," the governor said, laughing. "But I hope to have the fellow soon, and so put an end to that particular annoyance. Captain Ramon has sent for his big sergeant and his troopers to return. I brought an escort of 20,
And so we have ample men to run down this curse of Capistrano when next he makes his appearance."
"Let us hope it will end as it should," said Don Diego.
"A man in high office has many things with which to contend," the governor went on. "Look at what I was forced to do this day. I am called upon to put in prison a man of good blood, and his lady wife and tender daughter. But the state must be protected."
"I suppose you mean Don Carlos Pulido and his family?"
"I do, caballero."
"Now that it is called to my mind again, I must say a few words regarding that," Don Diego said. "I am not sure that my honor is not involved."
"Why, caballero, how can that be?"
"My father has ordered that I get me a wife and set up my establishment properly. Some days ago I requested of Don Carlos Pulido permission to pay my addresses to his daughter."
"Ha! I understand. But you are not the betrothed of the young lady."
"Not yet, Excellency."
"Then your honor is not involved, Don Diego, that I can see."
"But I have been paying court to her."
"You may thank the saints that it has gone no further, Don Diego. Think how it would look if you were allied with this family now. As for getting you a wife, come north with me to San Francisco de Assis, caballero, where the señoritas are far more lovely than here in your Southland. Look over those of good blood, and let me know your preference, and I'll guarantee that the lady will listen to your suit and accept your hand and name. And I can guarantee also that she will be of a loyal family with which it will be no shame to make a contract. We shall get you a wife of the proper sort, caballero."
"If you will pardon me, is it not taking stern measures to have Don Carlos and his ladies thrown into the carcel?" Don Diego asked, flicking dust from his sleeve.
"I find it necessary, señor."
"Do you think it will add to your popularity, Excellency?"
"Whether it does or not, the state must be served."
"Men of good blood hate to see such a thing, and there may be murmurings," Don Diego warned. "I should hate to see your Excellency make a wrong step at this juncture."
"What would you have me do?" the governor asked.
"Place Don Carlos and the ladies under arrest, if you will, but do not incarcerate them. It is unnecessary. They will not run away. Bring them to trial as gentlefolk should be brought to trial."
"You are bold, caballero."
"By the saints, am I talking too much?"
"It were better to leave these matters to the few of us who are trusted with attention to them," the governor said. "I can understand, of course, how it irks a man of good blood to see a don thrown into a carcel, and to see his ladies treated likewise. But in such a case as this—"
"I have not heard the nature of the case,"
Don Diego said. "Ha! Perhaps you may change your mind when you learn it. You have been speaking of this Señor Zorro. What if I tell you that the highwayman is being shielded and protected and fed by Don Carlos Pulido?"
"That is astonishing."
"And that the Doña Catalina is a party to the treason, and that the lovely señorita has seen fit to talk treasonably and dip her pretty hands into a conspiracy against the state."
"This is past belief," Don Diego cried.
"Some nights ago Señor Zorro was at the Pulido hacienda. Warning was fetched to the comandante by a native who is loyal. Don Carlos aided the bandit in tricking the soldiers, hid him in a closet, and when Captain Ramon was there alone, this highwayman stepped from the closet and attacked him treacherously and wounded him."
"By the saints!"
"And while you were gone and the Pulidos were your house guests, señor, Señor Zorro was in your house, speaking to the señorita, when the comandante walked in upon them. And the señorita grasped Captain Ramon by the arm and annoyed him until the Señor Zorro had made good his escape."
"It is past comprehension,"
Don Diego exclaimed. "Captain Ramon has placed before me 100 such items of suspicion. Can you wonder now that I had them placed in carcel? Did I merely have them put under arrest, this Signor Zorro would combine forces with them and aid them to escape.
And your intentions, Excellency?
I shall keep them in carcel while my troopers run down this highwayman. I shall force him to confess and implicate them, and then they shall have a trial.
These turbulent times,
Don Diego complained. As a loyal man, and I hope an admirer of mine, you should hope to see foes of the state confounded.
I do, most sincerely do I. All real foes of the state should receive punishment.
I am joyed to hear you say that, caballero, the governor cried, and he reached across the table and grasped Don Diego fervently by the hand. There was some more talk that amounted to nothing, and then Don Diego took his leave, for there were other men waiting to see the governor. After he had left the office, the governor looked across at Captain Ramon and smiled. You are right, Comandante, he said. Such a man could not be a traitor. It would tire him too much to think treasonable thoughts. What a man! He must be enough to drive that old fire-eater of a father of his insane. Don Diego made his way slowly down the hill, greeting those he passed, and stopping again to regard the little flowers that blossomed by the wayside. At the corner of the plaza he met a young caballero who was glad to call him friend, one of the small band of men who had spent the night at Don Alejandro's hacienda.
"Ah, Don Diego, a fair day to you," he cried,
and then he lowered his voice and stepped nearer.
"Has, by any chance, the man we call leader of our League of Adventures sent you a message this day?"
By the bright blue sky, no, Don Diego said. Why should the man?
"This Pulido business. It seems an outrage. Some of us have been wondering whether our leader does not intend to take a hand in it. We have been anticipating a message."
Oh, by the saints, oh, I trust not, Don Diego said. I could not endure an adventure of any sort tonight. My head aches, and I fear I'm going to have a fever. I shall have to see an apothecary about it. There are shiverings up and down my spine also. Is not that a symptom? During the siesta hour I was bothered with a pain in my left leg just above the knee. It must be the weather.
Let us hope that it will not result seriously, laughed his friend, and hurried on across the plaza.
Chapter 30. The Sign of the Fox. An hour after dusk that night, a native sought out one of the caballeros with the intelligence that a gentleman wished to speak to him immediately, and that this gentleman was evidently wealthy, since he had given the native a coin for carrying the message, when he might just as well have given nothing more than a cuff alongside the head. Also, that the mysterious gentleman would be waiting along the path that led toward the San Gabriel trail, and to be sure that the caballero would come, he had bade the native say that there was a fox in the neighborhood.
A fox! Zorro! Fox!
The caballero thought, and then he ruined the native forever by giving him another coin. He went to the rendezvous immediately, and there he found Signor Zorro sitting his big horse, his face masked, the cloak wrapped around his body.
You will pass the word, caballero, Signor Zorro said. I would have all men who are loyal and wish to do so meet at midnight in the little valley beyond the hill. You know the place? See? I shall be waiting.
Then Signor Zorro wheeled his horse and dashed away in the darkness, and the caballero went back to the pueblo and passed the word to those men he knew could be depended upon, and urged upon them that they pass it to others of the League. One went to Don Diego's house, but was told by the despensero that Don Diego had complained of a fever and had retired to his chamber, and had left word that he would flay alive any servant who dared enter the room unless he called. Near the hour of midnight, the caballeros began slipping from the pueblo one at a time, each upon the back of his best horse, and each armed with sword and pistol.
Each man had a mask that could be put over his features instantly, for that had been decided upon at Don Alejandro's hacienda, among other things. The pueblo was in darkness, save that there were lights in the tavern, where some of His Excellency's escort made merry with the local troopers. For Sergeant Pedro Gonzalez had returned with his men just before nightfall, glad to be back from a fruitless chase, and hoping that the next scent would be warmer. Those in the tavern had gone down the hill from the Presidio, some leaving their horses there without saddles or bridles on, and they had no thought of an encounter with Señor Zorro this night. The fat landlord was kept busy, for the soldiers from the north had coins in their purses and were willing to spend them. Sergeant Gonzalez, holding the attention of the company as usual, was detailing at length what he would do to this Señor Zorro if the saints were kind enough to let them meet and grant him his blade in his hand. There were lights in the big lounging room of the Presidio, too, for few of the soldiers had retired. And there were lights in the house where His Excellency was a guest, but the remainder of the pueblo was in darkness, and the people slept. In the carcel there was no light at all, except one candle burning in the office, where a sleepy man was on guard. The jailer was in his bed. Prisoners moaned on the hard benches in the prison room. Don Carlos Pulido stood before a window, looking up at the stars, and his wife and daughter huddled on a bench beside him, unable to sleep in such surroundings. The caballeros found Señor Zorro waiting for them as he had said he would be, but he remained aloof, scarcely speaking a word, until all were present. "Are all here?" he asked then. "All except Don Diego Vega," one replied. "He is ill with a fever, señor." And all the caballeros chuckled, for they had an idea the fever was caused by cowardice. "I take it that you know something of what is in my mind," Señor Zorro said. "We know what has happened to Don Carlos Pulido and the ladies of his family. We know they are innocent of any treason, and were they not, they should not have been taken to Carcel and incarcerated with common felons and drunkards. Think of those gentle ladies in such surroundings. Think of it, because Don Carlos has the ill will of the governor. It is the sense of the League that something be done in this matter? If it is not, then will I do something by myself." "Rescue them," a caballero said, and the others growled their approval. Here was a chance for risk and adventure and an opportunity to do a good deed. "We must enter the pueblo quietly," Señor Zorro said. "There is no moon, and we will not be observed if we use caution. We shall approach the carcel from the south. Each man will have his task to do. Some will surround the building to give notice if any approach it. Others must be ready to beat off the soldiers if they respond to an alarm. Others will effect an entrance to the carcel with me and rescue the prisoners." "It is an excellent plan," one said. "That is but a small part of it. Don Carlos is a proud man, and if given time for reflection may refuse to be rescued. We cannot allow that. Certain ones will seize him and take him from the place. Others will attend to the Doña Catalina. I will undertake to care for the señorita. Now, we have them free, and then what?" He heard murmurs, but no distinct reply, and so he continued to outline the plan. "All will ride to the highway just below this place," he said. "At that point we shall scatter. Those who have the Doña Catalina in charge will hasten with her to the hacienda of Don Alejandro Vega, where she can be hidden if necessary, and where the governor's soldiers will hesitate before entering and seizing her. Those who have Don Carlos in charge will take the road to Pala, and at a certain point some 10 miles from the pueblo they will be met by 2 natives of understanding, who will give the sign of the fox. The natives will take Don Carlos in charge and care for him. When these things are done, each caballero will ride to his home quietly and alone, telling what story pleases him and using great caution. I shall have conducted the señorita to a safe place by that time. She shall be given into the keeping of old Fray Felipe, a man we can trust, and he will hide her if he must. Then we will watch to see what the governor does." "What can he do?" a caballero asked. "Have them searched for, of course." "We must await developments," Señor Zorro said. "Are all now ready?" They assured him that they were, and so he named the men for each task, and then they left the little valley and rode slowly and cautiously around the little town, and approached it from the south. They heard the soldiers shouting and singing in the tavern, saw the lights in the presidio, and crept toward the carcel quietly, riding 2 by 2. In a short time it had been surrounded by quiet, determined men, and then Señor Zorro and 4 others dismounted and went to the door of the building. Chapter 31. The Rescue. Señor Zorro knocked upon it with the hilt of his sword. They heard a man gasp inside, presently heard his steps on the stone flooring, and after a little time light showed through the cracks, and the aperture was opened, and the sleepy face of the guard appeared. "What is wanted?" he asked. Señor Zorro thrust the muzzle of his pistol through the aperture and into the man's face, and in such fashion that the little door could not be closed. "Open, if you value your life. Open, and make not the slightest sound," Señor Zorro commanded. What is this?" "Señor Zorro is talking to you."
"By the saints!"
"Open, fool, or you die instantly."
"I'll open the door. Do not shoot, good Señor Zorro. I am only a poor guard and not a fighting man. I pray you do not shoot."
"Open quickly."
"As soon as I can fit key to lock, good Señor Zorro."
They heard him rattling the keys. Presently one was turned in the lock, and the heavy door was thrown open. Señor Zorro and his 4 companions rushed inside, and slammed and fastened the door again. The guard found the muzzle of a pistol pressed against the side of his head, and would have knelt before these 5 masked and terrible men, only one of them caught him by the hair and held him up. "Where sleeps the keeper of this infernal hole?" Señor Zorro demanded.
"In yonder room, señor."
"And where have you put Don Carlos Pulido and his ladies?"
"In the common prison room, señor."
Señor Zorro motioned to the others, strode across the room, and threw open the door to the jailer's chamber. The man already was sitting up in bed, having heard the sounds in the other room, and he blinked in fright when he beheld the highwayman by the light of the candle.
"Do not make a move, señor," Zorro warned. "One screech, and you are a dead man. Señor Zorro confronts you."
"May the saints preserve me!"
"Where are the keys to the prison rooms?"
On that table, señor."
Señor Zorro picked them up, and then whirled upon the jailer again, and rushed toward him.
"Lie down," he commanded. "On your face, scoundrel."
Señor Zorro tore strips from a blanket, and bound the jailer's hands and feet, and made a gag which he affixed.
"To escape death," he said then, "it is necessary for you to remain exactly as you are now, without making a sound, for some time after we have left the carcel. I shall leave it to your own judgment to decide the length of time."
Then he hurried back into the main office, beckoned the others, and led the way down the evil-smelling hall.
"Which door?" he asked of the guard.
"The second one, señor."
They hurried to it, and Señor Zorro unlocked it and threw it open. He forced the guard to hold a candle high above his head. A gasp of pity came from beneath the highwayman's mask. He saw the aged Don standing by the window, saw the 2 women crouched on the bench, saw the vile companions they had in this miserable place.
"Now may heaven forgive the governor!" he cried.
Señorita Lolita looked up in alarm, and then gave a glad cry. Don Carlos whirled at the highwayman's words.
"Señor Zorro!" he gasped. "The same, Don Carlos. I have come with some friends to rescue you." "I cannot allow it, señor. I shall not run away from what is in store for me, and it would avail me little to have you do the rescuing. I am accused now of harbouring you, I understand. How will it look, then, if you effect my escape?" "There is no time for argument," Señor Zorro said. I am not alone in this, but have 26 men with me, and a man of your blood, and gentle ladies such as those of your family, should not spend an entire night in this miserable hole if we can prevent it. Caballeros!" The last word was one of command. Two of the caballeros threw themselves upon Don Carlos, subdued him quickly, and half carried him into the hall and along it towards the office. Two others grasped the Dona Catalina by the arms, as gently as they could, and so carried her along. Señor Zorro bowed before the señorita and extended a hand, which she clasped gladly. "You must trust me, señorita," he said.
To love is to trust, señor.
"All things have been arranged. Ask no questions, but do as I bid. Come." He threw an arm around her, and so led her from the prison room, leaving the door open behind him. If some of the miserable wretches there could win through and out of the building, Señor Zorro had no wish to prevent them. More than half of them, he judged, were there because of prejudice or injustice. Don Carlos was causing an unearthly clamour, shouting that he refused to be rescued, and that he would stay and face the governor at the trial, and show the blood that was in him. Dona Catalina was whimpering a bit because of fright, but made no resistance. They reached the office, and Señor Zorro ordered the guard to a corner of it, with instructions to remain there quietly for some time after they had gone. And then one of the caballeros threw open the outside door. There was a tumult outside at that moment. Two soldiers had approached with a fellow caught stealing at the tavern, and the caballeros had stopped them. One glance at the masked faces had been enough to tell the troopers that here was something wrong. A soldier fired a pistol, and a caballero answered the fire, neither hitting the mark. But the shooting was enough to attract the attention of those in the tavern, and also of the guards at the Presidio. Troopers at the Presidio were awakened immediately, and took the places of the guards while the latter mounted and spurred down the hill to ascertain the cause of the sudden tumult at that hour of the night. Sergeant Pedro Gonzalez and others hurried from the tavern. Señor Zorro and his companions found themselves facing a resistance when they least expected it. The jailer had gathered courage enough to work himself free of gag and bonds, and he shrieked through a window of his chamber that prisoners were being rescued by Señor Zorro. His shriek was understood by Sergeant Gonzalez, who screeched for his men to follow him and earn a part of His Excellency's reward. But the caballeros had their 3 rescued prisoners on horseback, and they spurred through the gathering throng and so dashed across the plaza and toward the highway. Shots flew about them, but no man was hit. Don Carlos Pulido was still screaming that he refused to be rescued. Dona Catalina had fainted, for which the caballero who had her in charge was grateful, since he could give more attention to his horse and weapons. Señor Zorro rode wildly, with the Señorita Lolita in the saddle before him. He spurred his magnificent horse ahead of all the others, and so led the way to the highroad. And when he had reached it, he pulled up his mount and watched the others come galloping to the spot, to ascertain whether there had been casualties. "Carry out your orders, caballeros," he commanded when he saw that all had won through safely. And so the band was broken into 3 detachments. One rushed along the Palo road with Don Carlos. Another took the highway that would lead them to the hacienda of Don Alejandro. Señor Zorro, riding without any of his comrades at his side, galloped toward Fray Felipe's place, the señorita's arms clasped tightly about his neck, and the señorita's voice in his ear.
I knew that you would come for me, señor, she said. I knew you were a true man, and would not see me and my parents remain in that miserable place.
Señor Zorro did not answer her with words, for it was not a time for speech with his enemy so close at his heels, but his arm pressed the señorita closer to him. He had reached the crest of the first hill, and now he stopped the horse to listen for sounds of pursuit, and to watch the flickering lights far behind. For there was a multitude of lights in the plaza now, and in all the houses, for the pueblo had been aroused. The Presidio building was ablaze with light, and he could hear a trumpet being blown, and knew that every available trooper would be sent on the chase. The sound of galloping horses came to his ears. The troopers knew in what direction the rescuers had travelled, and the pursuit would be swift and relentless, with His Excellency on the scene to offer fabulous rewards and urge on his men with promises of good posts and a promotion. But one thing pleased Signor Zorro as his horse galloped down the dusty highway, and the señorita clung to him, and the keen wind cut into his face. He knew that the pursuit would have to be divided into 3 parties. He pressed the señorita to him again, put spurs to his horse, and rode furiously through the night. Chapter 32 Close Quarters. Over the hills peeped the moon. Signor Zorro would have had the sky heavy with clouds this night, and the moon obscured, could he have had things his own way, for now he was riding along the upper trail, and his pursuers were close behind, and could see him against the brightening sky. The horses ridden by the troopers were fresh, too, and the most of those belonging to the men of His Excellency's escort were magnificent beasts as swift as any in the country, and able to endure many miles of travel at a terrific pace. But now the highwayman thought only of getting all the speed possible out of his own mount, and of making as great as he could the distance between himself and those who followed, for at the end of his journey he would need quite a little time if he was to accomplish what he had set out to do. He bent low over the señorita and felt his horse with the reins, making himself almost a part of the animal he rode, as any good horseman can. He reached the crest of another hill, and glanced back before he began the descent into the valley. He could see the foremost of his pursuers. Had Signor Zorro been alone, no doubt the situation would have caused him no uneasiness, for many times he had been in a position more difficult, and had escaped. But the señorita was on the saddle before him now, and he wanted to get her to a place of safety, not only because she was the señorita and the woman he loved, but also because he was not the sort of man to let a prisoner he had rescued be recaptured. Such an event, he felt, would be a reflection on his skill and daring. Mile after mile he rode, the señorita clinging to him, and neither speaking a word. Signor Zorro knew that he had gained some on those who followed, but not enough to suit his purpose. Now he urged his horse to greater effort, and they flew along the dusty highway, past haciendas where the hounds barked in sudden alarm, past the huts of natives where the clamour of beating hoofs on the hard road caused bronzed men and women to tumble from their bunks and rush to their doors. Once he charged through a flock of sheep that was being driven to Reina de los Angeles and the market there, and scattered them to either side of the road, leaving cursing herders behind him. The herders gathered the flock again, just in time to have the pursuing soldiers scatter it once more. On and on he rode, until he could see, far ahead, the mission buildings at San Gabriel glistening in the moonlight. He came to a fork in the road, and took the trail that ran to the right, toward the hacienda of Fray Felipe. Signor Zorro was a reader of men, and he was trusting to his judgment tonight. He had known that the señorita Lolita would have to be left either where there were women, else where there was a robed Franciscan to stand guard over her, for Signor Zorro was determined to protect his lady's good name. And so he was pinning his faith to old Fray Felipe. Now the horse was galloping over softer ground, and was not making such good speed. Signor Zorro had little hope that the troopers would turn into the San Gabriel road when they arrived at the fork, as they might have done had it not been moonlight, and they had been unable to catch sight now and then of the man they pursued. He was within a mile of Fray Felipe's hacienda now, and once more he gave his horse the spurs in an effort to obtain greater speed. "I shall have scant time, señorita," he said, bending over her and speaking into her ear. "Everything may depend upon whether I have been able to judge a man correctly. I ask only that you trust me."
"You know I do that, señor."
"And you must trust the man to whom I am carrying you, señorita, and listen well to his advice upon all matters concerned with this adventure. The man is a Fray."
"Then everything will be well, señor,"
she replied, clinging to him closely. "If the saints are kind, we shall meet again soon, señorita. I shall count the hours, and deem each one of them an age. I believe there are happier days ahead for us."
"May heaven grant it," the girl breathed.
"Where there is love, there may be hope, señorita."
"Then my hope is great, señor."
"And mine," he said.
He turned his horse into Fray Felipe's driveway now, and dashed toward the house. His intention was to stop only long enough to leave the girl, hoping that Fray Felipe would afford her protection, and then ride on, making considerable noise and drawing the troopers after him. He wanted them to think that he was merely taking a short cut across Fray Felipe's land to the other road, and that he had not stopped at the house. He reined in his horse before the veranda steps, sprang to the ground, and lifted the señorita from the saddle, hurrying with her to the door. He beat against it with his fist, praying that Fray Felipe was a light sleeper and easily aroused. From the far distance there came a low drumming sound that he knew was made by the hoofs of his pursuers' horses. It seemed to Señor Zorro that it was an age before the old Fray threw open the door and stood framed in it, holding a candle in one hand. The highwayman stepped in swiftly and closed the door behind him, so no light would show outside. Fray Felipe had taken a step backward in astonishment when he beheld the masked man and the señorita he escorted.
"I am Señor Zorro, Fray," the highwayman said, speaking swiftly and in low tones. "Perhaps you may feel that you owe a small debt for certain things?"
For punishing those who oppressed and mistreated me, I owe you a large debt, caballero, though it is against my principles to countenance violence of any sort," Fray Felipe replied.
"I was sure that I had made no mistake in reading your character," Señor Zorro went on. "This señorita is Lolita, the only daughter of Don Carlos Pulido."
"Ha!"
"Don Carlos is a friend of the frailes, as you well know, and has known oppression and persecution the same as they. Today the governor came to Reina de los Angeles and had Don Carlos arrested and thrown into the carcel on a charge that has no true worth, as I happen to know. He also had the Doña Catalina and this young lady put in carcel, in the same prison room with drunkards and dissolute women. With the aid of some good friends, I rescued them."
"May the saints bless you, señor, for that kind action," Fray Felipe cried.
"Troopers are pursuing us, Fray. It is not seemly, of course, that the señorita ride farther with me alone. Do you take her and hide her, Fray, unless you fear that such a course may cause you grave trouble."
"Señor!"
Fray Felipe thundered. "If the soldiers take her, they will put her in carcel again, and probably she will be mistreated. Care for her then, protect her, and you will more than discharge any obligation you may feel that you owe me."
"And you, señor?"
"I shall ride on, that the troopers may pursue me and not stop here at your house. I shall communicate with you later, Fray. It is agreed between us?"
"It is agreed,"
Fray Felipe replied solemnly.
"And I would clasp you by the hand, señor."
That handclasp was short, yet full of expression for all that. Señor Zorro then whirled toward the door. "Blow out your candle," he directed. "They must see no light when I open the door." In an instant Fray Felipe had complied, and they were in darkness. Señorita Lolita felt Señor Zorro's lips press against her own for an instant, and knew that he had raised the bottom of his mask to give her this caress. And then she felt one of Fray Felipe's strong arms around her.
"Be of good courage, daughter,"
the Fray said.
"Señor Zorro, it appears, has as many lives as a cat, and something tells me he was not born to be slain by troopers of his excellency."
The highwayman laughed lightly at that, opened the door and darted through, closed it softly behind him, and so was gone. Great eucalyptus trees shrouded the front of the house in shadows, and in the midst of these shadows was Señor Zorro's horse. He noticed, as he ran toward the beast, that the soldiers were galloping down the driveway, that they were much nearer than he had expected to find them when he emerged from the house. He ran quickly toward his mount, tripped on a stone and fell, and frightened the animal so that it reared and darted half a dozen paces away, and into the full moonlight. The foremost of his pursuers shouted when he saw the horse, and dashed toward it. Señor Zorro picked himself up, gave a quick spring, caught the reins from the ground, and vaulted into the saddle. But they were upon him now, surrounding him, their blades flashing in the moonlight. He heard the raucous voice of Sergeant Gonzales ordering the men. "Alive, if you can, soldiers! His Excellency would see the rogue suffer for his crimes! At him, troopers! By the saints!" Señor Zorro parried a stroke with difficulty, and found himself unhorsed. On foot, he fought his way back into the shadows, and the troopers charged after him. With his back to the bole of a tree, Señor Zorro fought them off. 3 sprang from their saddles to rush in at him. He darted from the tree to another, but could not reach his horse. But one belonging to a dismounted trooper was near him, and he vaulted into the saddle and dashed down the slope toward the barns and corral. "After the rogue!" he heard Sergeant Gonzales shouting. "His Excellency will have us flayed alive if this pretty highwayman escapes us now." They charged after him, eager to win promotion and the reward. But Señor Zorro had some sort of a start of them, enough to enable him to play a trick. As he came into the shadow cast by a big barn, he slipped from the saddle, at the same time giving the horse he rode a cut with his rowels. The animal plunged ahead, snorting with pain and fright, running swiftly through the darkness toward the corral below. The soldiers dashed by in pursuit. Señor Zorro waited until they were past, and then he ran rapidly up the hill again. But he saw that some of the troopers had remained behind to guard the house, evidently with the intention of searching it later, and so he found he could not reach his horse. And once more there rang out that peculiar cry, half shriek and half moan, with which Señor Zorro had startled those at the hacienda of Don Carlos Pulido. His horse raised its head, whinnied once in answer to his call, and galloped toward him. Señor Zorro was in the saddle in an instant, spurring across a field directly in front of him. His horse went over a stone fence as if it had not been in the way, and after him speedily came a part of the troopers. They had discovered the trick he had used. They charged at him from both sides, met behind him, followed, and strained to cut down his lead. He could hear Sergeant Pedro Gonzales shouting lustily for them to make a capture in the name of the governor. He hoped that he had drawn them all away from Fray Felipe's house, but he was not sure, and the thing that demanded his attention the most now was the matter of his own escape. He urged his horse cruelly, knowing that this journey across ploughed ground was taking the animal's strength. He longed for a hard trail, the broad highway. And finally he reached the latter. Now he turned his horse's head toward Reina de los Angeles, for he had work to do there. There was no señorita before him on the saddle now, and the horse felt the difference. Señor Zorro glanced behind, and exulted to find that he was running away from the soldiers. Over the next hill, and he would be able to elude them. But he had to be on guard, of course, for there might be troopers in front of him, too. His Excellency might have sent reinforcements to Sergeant Gonzales, or might have men watching from the tops of the hills. He glanced at the sky, and saw that the moon was about to disappear behind a bank of clouds. He would have to make use of the short period of darkness, he knew. Down into the little valley he rode, and looked back to see that his pursuers were only at the crest of the hill. Then came the darkness, and at the proper time. Señor Zorro had a lead of half a mile on the pursuing soldiers now, but it was not his intention to allow them to chase him into the pueblo. He had friends in this locality. Beside the highway was an adobe hut, where there lived a native Señor Zorro had saved from a beating. Now he dismounted before the hut, and kicked against the door. The frightened native opened it. "I am pursued," Señor Zorro said. That appeared to be all that was necessary, for the native immediately threw the door of the hut open wider. Señor Zorro led his horse inside, almost filling the crude building, and the door was hastily shut again. Behind it, the highwayman and the native stood listening, the former with pistol in one hand and his naked blade in the other. Chapter 33. Flight and Pursuit. That the determined pursuit of Señor Zorro and his band of caballeros from the carcel had been taken up so quickly was due to Sergeant Pedro Gonzales. Sergeant Gonzalez had heard the shots and had rushed from the tavern with the other troopers at his heels, glad of an excuse to escape without paying for the wine he had ordered. He had heard the shout of the jailer and had understood it, and immediately had grasped the situation.
"Signor Zorro is rescuing the prisoners!" he screeched. "The highwayman is in our midst again! 2 horse troopers, and after him! There is a reward!"
They all knew about the reward, especially the members of the governor's bodyguard, who had heard His Excellency rave at mention of the highwayman's name and declare he would make a captain of the trooper who captured him or brought in his carcass. They rushed for their horses, swung themselves into their saddles, and dashed across the plaza toward the carcel, with Sergeant Gonzalez at their head. They saw the masked caballeros galloping across the plaza, and Sergeant Gonzalez rubbed his eyes with the back of one hand and swore softly that he had been taking so much wine. He had lied so often about Signor Zorro having a band of men at his back that here was the band materialized out of his falsehoods. When the caballeros split into 3 detachments, Sergeant Gonzalez and his troopers were so near them that they observed the maneuver. Gonzalez quickly made 3 troops of the men who followed him, and sent a troop after each band. He saw the leader of the caballeros turn toward San Gabriel. He recognized the leap of the great horse the highwayman rode, and he took after Signor Zorro with an exultant heart, being of a mind to capture or slay the highwayman rather than to retake any of the rescued prisoners. For Sergeant Pedro Gonzalez had not forgotten the time Signor Zorro had played with him in the tavern at Reina de los Angeles, nor had he given up the idea of taking his vengeance for it. He had seen Signor Zorro's horse run before, and he wondered a bit now because the highwayman was not putting greater distance between himself and his pursuers. And Sergeant Gonzalez guessed the reason, that Signor Zorro had Senorita Lolita Pulido on the saddle before him, and was carrying her away. Gonzalez was in the lead, and now and then he turned his head and shouted orders and encouragement to his troopers. The miles flew beneath them, and Gonzalez was glad because he was keeping Signor Zorro in sight.
"To Fray Felipe's, that is where he is riding," Gonzalez told himself. "I knew that old Fray was in league with the bandit. In some manner he tricked me when I sought the Signor Zorro at his hacienda before. Perhaps this highwayman has a clever hiding place there. Ha! By the saints, I shall not be tricked again."
On they rode, now and then catching glimpses of the man they pursued, and always in the mind of Gonzalez and his troopers were thoughts of the reward and promotion a capture would mean. Their horses were beginning to show some fatigue already, but they did not spare the animals. They saw Signor Zorro turn into the driveway that led to Fray Felipe's house, and Sergeant Gonzalez chuckled low down in his throat because he felt that he had guessed correctly. He had the highwayman now. If Signor Zorro continued to ride, he would be seen and followed because of the bright moonlight. If he stopped, Signor Zorro could not hope to cope successfully with half a score of troopers, with Gonzalez at their head. They dashed up to the front of the house and started to surround it. They saw Signor Zorro's horse, and then they saw the highwayman himself, and Gonzalez cursed because half a dozen troopers were between him and his prey, and were at him with their swords, threatening to end the business before Gonzalez could reach the scene. He tried to force his horse into the fight. He saw Signor Zorro spring into a saddle and dash away, and the troopers after him. Gonzalez, not being close, gave his attention to the other half of his duty. He bade some of his soldiers surround the house so that none could leave it. Then he saw Signor Zorro take the stone fence and started in pursuit, all except the guards around the house joining him. But Sergeant Gonzalez went only as far as the crest of the first hill. He noticed how the highwayman's horse was running, and realized that he could not be overtaken. Perhaps the sergeant could gain some glory if he returned to Fray Felipe's house and recaptured the señorita. The house was still being guarded when he dismounted before it, and his men reported that none had attempted to leave the building. He called 2 of his men to his side and knocked on the door. Almost instantly it was opened by Fray Felipe.
"Are you just from bed, Fray?" Gonzalez asked.
Is it not a time of night for honest men to be abed? Fray Felipe asked in turn.
It is, Fray, yet we find you out of it. How does it happen that you have not come from the house before? Did we not make enough noise to awaken you?
I heard sounds of combat.
And you may hear more, Fray, else feel the sting of a whip again, unless you answer questions swiftly and to the point. Do you deny that Señor Zorro has been here?
I do not.
Ha! Now we have it. You admit, then, that you are in league with this pretty highwayman? That you shield him upon occasion? You admit that, Fray?
I admit nothing of the sort, Fray Felipe replied. I never set my eyes on this Señor Zorro, to my knowledge, until a very few minutes ago.
That is a likely story. Tell it to the stupid natives. But do not try to tell it to a wise trooper, Fray. What did the Señor Zorro wish?
You were so close upon the man's heels, señor, that he scarce had time to wish for anything, Fray Felipe said.
Yet you had some speech with him.
I opened the door at his knock, señor, the same as I opened it at yours.
What said he?
That soldiers were pursuing him.
And he asked that you hide him so he could escape capture at our hands?
He did not.
Wanted a fresh horse, did he?
He did not say as much, señor. If he is such a thief as he is painted, undoubtedly he would merely have taken a horse without asking, had he wanted it.
Ha! What business had he with you, then? It would be well for you to answer openly, Fray.
Did I say that he had business with me?
Ha! By the saints!
The saints are better off your lips, señor, boaster and drunkard.
Do you wish to receive another beating, Fray? I am riding on His Excellency's business. Do not you delay me further. What said this pretty highwayman?
Nothing that I am at liberty to repeat to you, señor, Fray Felipe said. Sergeant Gonzalez pushed him aside roughly and entered the living room, and his two troopers followed at his heels.
Light the candelero,
Gonzalez commanded his men.
Take candles if you can find any. We search the house.
You search my poor house? Fray Felipe cried. And what do you expect to find? Fray Felipe asked.
I expect to find a piece of merchandise this pretty Señor Zorro left here, Fray.
What do you imagine he left?
Ha! A package of clothing, I suppose. A bundle of loot. A bottle of wine. A saddle to be mended. What would the fellow leave, Fray? One thing impresses me. Señor Zorro's horse carried double when he arrived at your house, and was carrying none but Señor Zorro when he departed.
And you expect to find?
The other half of the horse's load, replied Gonzalez. Failing to find it, we may try a twist or two of your arm to see whether you can be made to speak.
You would dare? You would so affront a Fray? You would descend to torture?
Meal mush and goat's milk, quoth Sergeant Gonzalez. You fooled me once in some manner, but you will not so fool me again. Search the house, troopers, and be sure that you search it well. I shall remain in this room and keep this entertaining Fray company. I shall endeavor to discover what his sensations were when he was being whipped for swindling.
Coward and brute, Fray Felipe thundered, there may come a time when persecution shall cease.
Meal mush and goat's milk.
When this disorder shall end, and honest men be given their just dues, Fray Felipe cried. When those who have founded a rich empire here shall receive the true fruits of their labor and daring, instead of having them stolen by dishonest politicians and men who stand in their favor.
Goat's milk and meal mush, Fray.
When there shall be 1,000 Señor Zorros, and more if necessary, to ride up and down El Camino Real and punish those who do wrong. Sometimes I would that I were not a Fray, that I might play such a game myself.
We'd run you down in short order and stretch a rope with your weight, Sergeant Gonzalez told him. Did you help His Excellency's soldiers more, Perhaps His Excellency would treat you with more consideration.
I give aid to no spawn of the devil, Fray Felipe said.
Ha! Now you grow angry, and that is against your principles. Is it not the part of a robed fray to receive what comes his way and give thanks for it, no matter how much it chokes him? Answer me that, angry one.
You have about as much knowledge of a Franciscan's principles and duties as has the horse you ride.
I ride a wise horse, a noble animal. He comes when I call, and gallops when I command. Do not deride him until you ride him.
Ha! An excellent jest. Imbecile!
Meal mush and goat's milk, said Sergeant Gonzales.
Chapter 34. The Blood of the Pulidos. The two troopers came back into the room. They had searched the house well, they reported, invading every corner of it, and no trace had been found of any person other than Fray Felipe's native servants, all of whom were too terrified to utter a falsehood, and had said they had seen nobody around the place who did not belong there.
Ha! Hidden away well, no doubt, Gonzales said. Fray, what is that in the corner of the room?
Bales of hides, Fray Felipe replied.
I have been noticing it from time to time. The dealer from San Gabriel must have been right when he said the hides he purchased of you were not properly cured. Are those?
I think you will find them so.
Then why did they move? Sergeant Gonzales asked. 3 times I saw the corner of a bale move. Soldiers, search there.
Fray Felipe sprang to his feet.
Enough of this nonsense, he cried. You have searched and found nothing. Search the barns next, and then go. At least let me be a master in my own house. You have disturbed my rest enough as it is.
You will take a solemn oath, Fray, that there is nothing alive behind those bales of hides?
Fray Felipe hesitated, and Sergeant Gonzales grinned.
Not ready to forswear yourself, eh? The sergeant asked. I had a thought you would hesitate at that, my robed Franciscan. Soldiers, search the bales.
The two men started toward the corner, but they had not covered one half the distance when Señorita Lolita Pulido stood up behind the bales of hides and faced them.
Ha! Unearthed at last! Gonzales cried. Here is the package Señor Zorro left in the Fray's keeping, and a pretty package it is. Back to Carcel she goes, and this escape will but make her final sentence the greater.
But there was Pulido blood in the señorita's veins, and Gonzales had not taken that into account. Now the señorita stepped to the edge of the pile of hides so that light from the candelero struck full upon her.
"One moment, señores,"
she said. One hand came from behind her back, and in it she held a long, keen knife, such as sheep skinners used. She put the point of the knife against her breast and regarded them bravely.
"Señorita Lolita Pulido does not return to the foul carcel now or at any time, señores," she said. "Rather would she plunge this knife into her heart, and so die as a woman of good blood should. If His Excellency wishes for a dead prisoner, he may have one."
Sergeant Gonzales uttered an exclamation of annoyance. He did not doubt that the señorita would do as she had threatened, if the men made an attempt to seize her. And while he might have ordered the attempt in the case of an ordinary prisoner, he did not feel sure that the governor would say he had done right if he ordered it now. After all, Señorita Pulido was the daughter of a don, and her self-inflicted death might cause trouble for His Excellency. It might prove the spark to the powder magazine.
"Señorita, the person who takes his or her own life risks eternal damnation," the sergeant said. "Ask this Fray if it is not so. You are only under arrest, not convicted and sentenced. If you are innocent, no doubt you soon will be set at liberty."
"It is no time for lying speeches, señor," the girl replied. "I realize the circumstances only too well. I have said that I will not return to Carcel, and I meant it, and mean it now. One step toward me, and I take my own life."
"Señorita,"
Fray Felipe began.
It is useless for you to attempt to prevent me, good Fray, she interrupted. I have pride left me, thank the saints. His Excellency gets only my dead body, if he gets me at all.
Here is a pretty mess, Sergeant Gonzalez exclaimed. I suppose there is nothing for us to do except retire and leave the señorita to her freedom.
Ah, no, señor, she cried quickly. You are clever, but not clever enough by far. You would retire and continue to have your men surround the house? You would watch for an opportunity and then seize me?
Gonzalez growled low in his throat, for that had been his intention, and the girl had read it.
I shall be the one to leave, she said. Walk backward and stand against the wall, señores. Do it immediately, or I plunge this knife into my bosom.
They could do nothing except obey. The soldiers looked to the sergeant for instructions, and the sergeant was afraid to risk the señorita's death, knowing it would call down upon his head the wrath of the governor, who would say that he had bungled. Perhaps, after all, it would be better to let the girl leave the house. She might be captured afterward, for surely a girl could not escape the troopers. She watched them closely as she darted across the room to the door. The knife was still held at her breast.
Fray Felipe, you wish to go with me? She asked. You may be punished if you remain.
Yet I must remain, señorita. I could not run away. May the saints protect you.
She faced Gonzalez and the soldiers once more.
I am going through this door, she said. You will remain in this room. There are troopers outside, of course, and they will try to stop me. I shall tell them that I have your permission to leave. If they call and ask you, you are to say that it is so.
And if I do not?
Then I use the knife, señor.
She opened the door, turned her head for an instant, and glanced out.
I trust that your horse is an excellent one, señor, for I intend to use it,
she told the sergeant. She darted suddenly through the door and slammed it shut behind her.
After her! Gonzalez cried. I looked into her eyes. She will not use the knife. She fears it.
He hurled himself across the room, the two soldiers with him. But Fray Felipe had been passive long enough. He went into action now. He did not stop to consider the consequences. He threw out one leg and tripped Sergeant Gonzalez. The two troopers crashed into him, and all went to the floor in a tangle. Fray Felipe had gained some time for her, and it had been enough. For the señorita had rushed to the horse and had jumped into the saddle. She could ride like a native. Her tiny feet did not reach halfway to the sergeant's stirrups, but she thought nothing of that. She wheeled the horse's head, kicked at his sides as a trooper rushed around the corner of the house. A pistol ball whistled past her head. She bent lower over the horse's neck and rode. Now a cursing Sergeant Gonzalez was on the veranda, shouting for his men to get to horse and follow her. The tricky moon was behind a bank of clouds again. They could not tell the direction the señorita was taking except by listening for the sounds of the horses' hoofs. And they had to stop to do that, and if they stopped, they lost time and distance. Chapter 35. The Clash of Blades Again. Señor Zorro stood like a statue in the native's hut, one hand grasping his horse's muzzle, the native crouched at his side. Down the highway came the drumming of horses' hoofs. Then the pursuit swept by, the men calling to one another and cursing the darkness, and rushed down the valley. Señor Zorro opened the door and glanced out, listened for a moment, and then led out his horse. He tendered the native a coin. "Not from you, señor," the native said. "Take it. You have need of it, and I have not," the highwayman said. He vaulted into the saddle and turned his horse up the steep slope of the hill behind the hut. The animal made little noise as it climbed to the summit. Señor Zorro descended into the depression on the other side, and came to a narrow trail, and along this he rode at a slow gallop, stopping his mount now and then to listen for sounds of other horsemen who might be abroad. He rode toward Reina de los Angeles, but he appeared to be in no hurry about arriving at the pueblo. Señor Zorro had another adventure planned for this night, and it had to be accomplished at a certain time and under certain conditions. It was 2 hours later when he came to the crest of the hill above the town. He sat quietly in the saddle for some time, regarding the scene. The moonlight was fitful now, but now and then he could make out the plaza. He saw no troopers, heard nothing of them, decided that they had ridden back in pursuit of him, and that those who had been sent in pursuit of Don Carlos and the Doña Catalina had not yet returned. In the tavern there were lights, and in the presidio and in the house where His Excellency was a guest. Señor Zorro waited until it was dark, and then urged his horse forward slowly, but off the main highway. He circled the pueblo, and in time approached the presidio from the rear. He dismounted now and led his horse, going forward slowly, often stopping to listen, for this was a very ticklish business, and might end in disaster if a mistake were made. He stopped the horse behind the presidio, where the wall of the building would cast a shadow if the moon came from behind the clouds again, and went forward cautiously, following the wall as he had done on that other night. When he came to the office window, he peered inside. Captain Ramon was there, alone, looking over some reports spread on the table before him, evidently awaiting the return of his men. Señor Zorro crept to the corner of the building and found there was no guard. He had guessed and hoped that the Comandante had sent every available man to the chase, but he knew that he would have to act quickly, for some of the troopers might return. He slipped through the door and crossed the big lounging room, and so came to the door of the office. His pistol was in his hand, and could a man have seen behind the mask he would have observed that Señor Zorro's lips were crushed in a thin straight line of determination. As upon that other night, Captain Ramon whirled around in his chair when he heard the door open behind him, and once more he saw the eyes of Señor Zorro glittering through his mask, saw the muzzle of the pistol menacing him. "Not a move, not a sound. It would give me pleasure to fill your body with hot lead," Señor Zorro said. "You are alone. Your silly troopers are chasing me where I am not." "By the saints," Captain Ramon breathed. "Not so much as a whisper, señor, if you hope to live. Turn your back to me." "You would murder me?" "I am not that sort, Commandante, and I said for you to make not a sound. Put your hands behind your back, for I am going to bind your wrists." Captain Ramon complied. Señor Zorro stepped forward swiftly and bound the wrists with his own sash, which he tore from his waist. Then he whirled Captain Ramon around so that he faced him. "Where is His Excellency?" he asked. "At Don Juan Estados's house." "I knew as much, but wanted to see whether you prefer to speak the truth tonight. It is well if you do so. We are going to call upon the governor." "To call upon His Excellency," I said, "and do not speak again. Come with me." He grasped Captain Ramon by the arm and hurried him from the office, across the lounging room, out of the door. He piloted him around the building to where the horse was waiting. "Mount," he commanded. "I shall sit behind you, with the muzzle of this pistol at the base of your brain. Make no mistake, Comandante, unless you are tired of life. I am a determined man this night." Captain Ramon had observed it. He mounted as he was directed, and the highwayman mounted behind him, and held the reins with one hand and the pistol with the other. Captain Ramon could feel the touch of cold steel at the back of his head. Señor Zorro guided his horse with his knees instead of with the reins. He urged the beast down the slope, and circled the town once more, keeping away from the beaten trails, and so approached the rear of the house where His Excellency was a guest. Here was the difficult part of the adventure. He wanted to get Captain Ramon before the governor, to talk to both of them, and to do it without having anybody else interfere. He forced the captain to dismount, and led him to the rear wall of the house. There was a patio there, and they entered it. It appeared that Señor Zorro knew the interior of the house well. He entered it through a servant's room, taking Captain Ramon with him, and passed through into a hall without awakening the sleeping native. They went along the hall slowly, From one room came the sound of snoring. From beneath the door of another, light streamed. Signor Zorro stopped before that door and applied an eye to a crack at the side of it. If Captain Ramon harboured thoughts of voicing an alarm, or of offering battle, the touch of the pistol at the back of his head caused him to forget them. And he had scant time to think of a way out of this predicament, for suddenly Signor Zorro threw open the door, hurled Captain Ramon through it, followed himself, and shut the door quickly behind him. In the room there were His Excellency and his host. "Silence, and do not move," Signor Zorro said. "The slightest alarm, and I put a pistol ball through the governor's head. That is understood? Very well, signores." "Signor Zorro!" the governor gasped. "The same, your Excellency. I ask your host to be not frightened, for I mean him no harm if he sits quietly until I am done. Captain Ramon, kindly sit across the table from the governor. I am delighted to find the head of the state awake and awaiting news from those who are chasing me. His brain will be clear, and he can understand better what is said." "What means this outrage?" the governor exclaimed. "Captain Ramon, how comes this? Seize this man. You are an officer." "Do not blame the Commandante," Signor Zorro said. "He knows it is death to make a move. There is a little matter that needs explanation, and since I cannot come to you in broad day as a man should, I am forced to adopt this method. Make yourselves comfortable, signores. This may take some little time." His Excellency fidgeted in his chair. "You have this day insulted a family of good blood, your Excellency," Signor Zorro went on. "You have forgotten the proprieties to such an extent that you have ordered thrown into your miserable carcel a hidalgo and his gentle wife and innocent daughter. You have taken such means to gratify a spite." "They are traitors," His Excellency said. "What have they done of treason?" "You are an outlaw with a price put upon your head. They have been guilty of harbouring you, giving you aid." "Where got you this information?" "Captain Ramon has an abundance of evidence." "Ha! The Commandante, eh? We shall see about that. Captain Ramon is present, and we can get at the truth. May I ask the nature of your evidence?" "You were at the Pulido hacienda," the governor said. "I admit it." "A native saw you and carried word to the Presidio. The soldiers hurried out to effect your capture." "A moment. Who said a native sounded the alarm?" "Captain Ramon assured me so." "Here is the first chance for the captain to speak the truth. As a matter of fact, Commandante, was it not Don Carlos Pulido himself who sent the native? The truth?" "It was a native brought word." "And he did not tell your sergeant that Don Carlos had sent him? Did he not say that Don Carlos had slipped him the information in whispers while he was carrying his fainting wife to her room? Is it not the truth that Don Carlos did his best to hold me at his hacienda until the soldiers arrived, that I might be captured? Did not Don Carlos thus try to show his loyalty to the governor?" "By the saints, Ramon, you never told me as much," His Excellency cried. "They are traitors," the captain declared stubbornly. "What other evidence?" Signor Zorro asked. "Why, when the soldiers arrived, you concealed yourself by some trick," the governor said. "And presently Captain Ramon himself reached the scene, and while he was there you crept from a closet, ran him through treacherously from behind, and made your escape. It is an evident fact that Don Carlos had hidden you in the closet." "By the saints!" Signor Zorro swore. "I had thought, Captain Ramon, that you were man enough to admit defeat, though I knew you for a scoundrel in other things. Tell the truth." "That is the truth." "Tell the truth," Signor Zorro commanded, stepping closer to him and bringing up the pistol. "I came from that closet and spoke to you. I gave you time to draw blade and get on guard. We fenced for fully 10 minutes, did we not? I admit freely that for a moment you puzzled me, and then I solved your method of giving battle and I knew you were at my mercy. And then, when I could have slain you easily, I but scratched your shoulder. Is not that the truth? Answer, as you hope to live." Captain Ramon licked his dry lips and could not meet the governor's eyes.
Answer!
Signor Zorro thundered.
It is the truth,
the captain acknowledged.
Ha! So I ran you through from behind, eh? It is an insult to my blade to have it enter your body. You see, your Excellency, what manner of man you have for a commandante here. Is there more evidence?
There is, the governor said. When the Politos were guests at the house of Don Diego Vega, and Don Diego was away, Captain Ramon went to pay his respects and found you there alone with the señorita.
And that shows what?
That you are in league with the Politos, that they harbored you even in the house of Don Diego, a loyal man. And when the captain discovered you there, the señorita flung herself upon him and held him, delayed him, rather, until you made your escape through a window. Is not that enough?
Signor Zorro bent forward, and his eyes seemed to burn through the mask and into those of Captain Ramon. So that is the tale he told, eh? The highwayman said. As a matter of fact, Captain Ramon is enamoured of the señorita. He went to the house, found her alone, forced his attentions upon her, even told her that she should not object, since her father was in the bad graces of the governor. He attempted to caress her, and she called for help. I responded.
How did you happen to be there?
I do not care to answer that, but I take my oath the señorita did not know of my presence. She called for aid, and I responded. I made this thing you call a commandante kneel before her and apologize, and then I took him to the door and kicked him out into the dust. And afterwards I visited him at the Presidio, and told him that he had given insult to a noble señorita.
It appears that you hold some love for her yourself, the governor said.
I do, your Excellency, and am proud to admit it.
Ha! You condemn her and her parents by that statement. You deny now that they are in league with you?
I do. Her parents do not know of our love.
This señorita is scarcely conventional.
Signor, governor or no, another thought like that, and I spill your blood, Signor Zorro cried. I have told you what happened that night in the house of Don Diego Vega. Captain Ramon will testify that what I have said is the exact truth. Is it not, Comandante? Answer.
It is the truth, the captain gulped, looking at the muzzle of the highwayman's pistol.
Then you have told me falsehood, and can no longer be an officer of mine, the governor cried. It appears that this highwayman can do as he pleases with you. Ha! But I still believe that Don Carlos Polito is a traitor, and the members of his family, and it has availed you nothing, Signor Zorro, to play this little scene. My soldiers shall continue to pursue them, and you, and before they are done, I'll have the Politos dragged in the dirt, and I'll have you stretching a rope with your carcass.
Quite a bold speech, observed Signor Zorro. You set your soldiers a pretty task, your Excellency. I rescued your 3 prisoners tonight, and they have escaped.
They shall be retaken.
Time alone will tell that, and now I have another duty to perform here. Your Excellency, you will take your chair to that far corner and sit there, and your host will sit beside you, and there you shall remain until I have finished.
What do you mean to do?
Obey me, Signor Zorro cried. I have scant time for argument, even with a governor. He watched while the 2 chairs were placed, and the governor and his host had seated themselves, and then he stepped nearer Captain Ramon. You insulted a pure and innocent girl, Comandante, he said. For that you shall fight. Your scratched shoulder is healed now, and you wear your blade by your side. Such a man as you is not fit to breathe God's pure air. The country is better for your absence. On your feet, senor, and on guard. Captain Ramon was white with rage. He knew that he was ruined. He had been forced to confess that he had lied. He had heard the governor remove his rank, and this man before him had been the cause of it all. Perhaps, in his anger, he could kill this Signor Zorro, stretch this curse of Capistrano on the floor with his life-blood flowing away. Perhaps, if he did that, his Excellency would relent. He sprang from his chair and backward to the governor. "Unfasten my wrists!" he cried. "Let me at this dog!" "You were as good as dead before. You certainly are dead after using that word," Signor Zorro said calmly. The Comandante's wrists were untied. He whipped out his blade, sprang forward with a cry, and launched himself in a furious attack upon the highwayman. Signor Zorro gave ground before this onslaught, and so obtained a position where the light from the candelero did not bother his eyes. He was skilled with the blade, and had fenced for life many times, and he knew the danger in the attack of an angered man who did not fence according to the code. And he knew, too, that such anger is spent quickly, unless a fortunate thrust makes the possessor of it victor almost at once, and so he retreated step by step, guarding well, parrying vicious strokes, alert for an unexpected move. The governor and his host were sitting in their corner, but bending forward and watching the combat. "Run him through, Ramon, and I reinstate and promote you," His Excellency cried. The Comandante thus was urged to do it. Signor Zorro found his opponent fighting much better than he had before in Don Carlos Polito's house at the hacienda. He found himself forced to fight out of a dangerous corner, and the pistol he held in his left hand to intimidate the governor and his host bothered him. And suddenly he tossed it to the table, and then swung around so that neither of the two men could dart from a corner and get it without running the chance of receiving a blade between the ribs. And there he stood his ground and fought. Captain Ramon could not force him to give way now. His blade seemed to be a score. It darted in and out, trying to find a resting place in the captain's body, for Signor Zorro was eager to have an end of this and be gone. He knew that the dawn was not far away, and he feared that some trooper might come to the house with a report for the governor. "Fight, insulter of girls!" he cried. "Fight, man who tells a falsehood to injure a noble family! Fight, coward and poltroon! Now death stares you in the face, and soon you'll be claimed. Ha! I almost had you then. Fight, cur!" Captain Ramon cursed and charged, but Signor Zorro received him and drove him back, and so held his position. The perspiration was standing out on the captain's forehead in great globules. His breath was coming heavily from between his parted lips. His eyes were bright and bulging. "Fight, weakling!" the highwayman taunted him. "This time I am not attacking from behind. If you have prayers to say, say them, for your time grows short." The ringing blades, the shifting feet on the floor, the heavy breathing of the combatants and of the two spectators of this life and death struggle were the only sounds in the room. His Excellency sat far forward on his chair, his hands gripping the edges of it so that his knuckles were white. "Kill me this highwayman!" he shrieked. "Use your good skill, Ramon! At him!" Captain Ramon rushed again, calling into play his last bit of strength, fencing with what skill he could command. His arms were as lead, his breath was fast. He thrust, he lunged, and made a mistake of a fraction of an inch. Like the tongue of a serpent, Signor Zorro's blade shot in. Thrice it darted forward, and upon the fair brow of Ramon, just between the eyes, there flamed suddenly a red, bloody letter Z. "The Mark of Zorro!" the highwayman cried. "You wear it forever now, Comandante." Signor Zorro's face became more stern. His blade shot in again and came out dripping red. The Comandante gasped and slipped to the floor. "You have slain him!" the governor cried. "You have taken his life, wretch!" "Ha! I trust so. The thrust was through the heart, Excellency. He never will insult a señorita again." Signor Zorro looked down at his fallen foe, regarded the governor a moment, then wiped his blade on the sash that had bound the Comandante's wrists. He returned the blade to its scabbard, and picked up his pistol from the table. "My night's work is done," he said. "And you shall hang for it!" His Excellency cried. "Perhaps, when you catch me," replied the curse of Capistrano, bowing ceremoniously. Then, without glancing again at the twitching body of him who had been Captain Ramon, he whirled through the door and was in the hall, and rushed through it to the patio and to his horse. Chapter 36. All against them. And he rushed into danger. The dawn had come. The first pink streaks had appeared in the eastern sky, and then the sun had risen quickly above the heights to the east, and now the plaza was bathed in brilliance. There was no mist, no high fog even, and objects on the hillsides far away stood out in relief. It was no morning in which to ride for life and freedom. Señor Zorro had delayed too long with the governor and comandante, else had misjudged the hour. He swung into his saddle and urged his beast out of the patio, and then a full realization of his imminent peril came to him. Down the trail from San Gabriel came Sergeant Pedro Gonzalez and his troopers. Down the Palo road came another detachment of soldiers that had been trailing the caballeros and Don Carlos, and had given up in disgust. Over the hill toward the Presidio came the third body of men, who had been in chase of those who had rescued the Dona Catalina. Señor Zorro found himself hemmed in by his foes. The curse of Capistrano deliberately stopped his horse and for a moment contemplated the outlook. He glanced at the three bodies of troopers, estimated distance, and in that instant one with Sergeant Gonzalez's detachment saw him and raised the alarm. They knew that magnificent horse, that long purple cloak, that black mask and wide sombrero. They saw before them the man they had been pursuing throughout the night, the man who had made fools of them and played with them about the hills and valleys. They feared the rage of His Excellency and their superior officers, and in their hearts and minds was determination to capture or slay this curse of Capistrano now as this last chance was offered them. Señor Zorro put spurs to his horse and dashed across the plaza, in full view of some score of citizens. Just as he did that, the governor and his host rushed from the house, shrieking that Señor Zorro was a murderer and should be taken. Natives scurried like so many rats for shelter. Men of rank stood still and gaped in astonishment. Señor Zorro, having crossed the plaza, drove his horse at highest speed straight toward the highway. Sergeant Gonzalez and his troopers rushed to cut him off and turn him back, shrieking at one another, pistols in their hands, blades loosened in their scabbards. Reward and promotion and satisfaction were to be their lot if they made an end of the highwayman here and now. Señor Zorro was forced to swerve from his first course, for he saw that he could not win through. He had not taken his pistol from his belt, but he had drawn his blade, and it dangled from his right wrist in such fashion that he could grip the hilt of it instantly and put it into play. He cut across the plaza again, almost running down several men of rank who were in the way. He passed within a few paces of the infuriated governor and his host, darted between two houses, and rushed toward the hills in that direction. It appeared that he had some small chance of escaping the cordon of his foes now. He scorned paths and trails and cut across the open ground. From both sides the troopers galloped to meet him, flying toward the angle of the wedge, hoping to reach it in time and turn him back once more. Gonzalez was shouting orders in his great voice, and he was sending a part of his men down into the pueblo, so that they would be in proper position in case the highwayman turned back again, and could keep him from escaping to the west. He reached the highway and started down it toward the south. It was not the direction he would have preferred, but he had no choice now. He dashed around a curve in the road, where some natives' huts cut off the view, and suddenly he pulled up his horse, almost unseating himself. For here a new menace presented itself. Straight at him along the highway flew a horse and rider, and close behind came half a dozen troopers in pursuit. Señor Zorro whirled his horse. He could not turn to the right because of a stone fence. His horse could have jumped it, but on the other side was soft, ploughed ground, and he knew he could make no progress across it, and that the troopers might cut him down with a pistol bullet. Nor could he turn to the left, for there was a sheer precipice down which he could not hope to ride with safety. He had to turn back towards Sergeant Gonzalez and the men who rode with him, hoping to get a distance of a couple of 100 yards, where he could make a descent before Gonzalez and his men arrived at the spot. He gripped his sword now and was prepared for fight, for he knew it was going to be close work. He glanced back over his shoulder and gasped his surprise, for it was Señorita Lolita Polito who rode that horse and was pursued by the half-dozen troopers, and he had thought her safe at the hacienda of Fray Felipe. Her long black hair was down and streaming out behind her. Her tiny heels were glued to the horse's flanks. She bent forward as she rode, holding the reins low down, and Signor Zorro, even in that instant, marvelled at her skill with the mount. "Signor!" he heard her shout. And then she had reached his side, and they rode together, dashing down upon Gonzales and his troopers. "They have been chasing me for hours," she gasped. "I escaped them at Fray Felipe's."
"Ride close, do not waste breath," he screeched.
"My horse, it is almost done, signor."
Signor Zorro glanced aside at the beast, and saw that he was suffering from fatigue, but there was scant time to consider that now. The soldiers behind had gained some; those in front presented a lively menace that required deep consideration. Down the trail they flew, side by side, straight at Gonzales and his men. Signor Zorro could see that pistols were out, and he doubted not that the governor had given orders to get him, dead or alive, but to see that he did not escape again. Now he spurred a few paces in advance of the señorita, and called upon her to ride his horse's tracks. He dropped the reins on his mount's neck, and held his blade ready. He had two weapons, his blade and his horse. Then came the crash. Signor Zorro swerved his horse at the proper instant, and the señorita followed him. He cut at the trooper on his left, swung over and cut at the one on his right. His horse crashed into that of a third trooper, and hurled it against the animal the sergeant rode. He heard shrill cries about him. He knew that the men who had been pursuing Señorita Lolita had run into the others, and that there was a certain amount of confusion, that they could not use blades for fear of cutting down one another. And then he was through them, with the señorita riding at his side again. Once more he was at the edge of the plaza. His horse was showing signs of weariness, and he had gained nothing. For the way to San Gabriel was not open. The way to Palo was closed. He could not hope to escape by cutting across soft ground, and on the opposite side of the plaza were more troopers, in saddle and waiting to cut him off, no matter in which direction he started.
"We are caught," he shouted, "but we are not done, señorita."
"My horse is stumbling," she cried.
Signor Zorro saw that it was so. He knew that the beast could not make another 100 yards. "To the tavern!" he cried. They galloped straight across the plaza. At the door of the tavern the señorita's horse staggered and fell. Signor Zorro caught the girl in his arms in time to save her from a hard fall, and, still carrying her, darted through the tavern door. "Out!" he cried to the landlord and the native servant. "Out!" he shrieked to half a dozen loiterers, exhibiting his pistol. They rushed through the door and into the plaza. The highwayman threw the door shut and bolted it. He saw that every window was closed except the one that fronted on the plaza, and that the board and skin coverings were in place. He stepped to the table and then whirled to face the señorita. "It may be the end," he said.
"Signor, surely the saints will be kind to us."
"We are beset by foes, señorita. I care not, so that I die fighting as a caballero should. But you, señorita—"
"They shall never put me in the foul carcel again, signor. I swear it. Rather would I die with you."
She took the sheepskinner's knife from her bosom, and he caught a glance of it.
"Not that, señorita!" he cried.
"I have given you my heart, signor. Either we live together, or we die together."
Chapter 37. The Fox at Bay. He darted to the window and glanced out. The troopers were surrounding the building. He could see the governor stalking across the plaza, crying his orders. Down the San Gabriel trail came the proud Don Alejandro Vega to pay his visit to the governor, and he stopped at the plaza's edge and began questioning men regarding the cause for the tumult.
"All are in at the death," Signor Zorro said, laughing. "I wonder where my brave caballeros are, those who rode with me."
"You expect their aid?" she asked.
"Not so, señorita. They would have to stand together and face the governor, tell him their intentions. It was a lark with them, and I doubt whether they take it seriously enough to stand by me now. It is not to be expected. I fight it out alone."
"Not alone, signor, when I am by your side."
He clasped her in his arms, pressed her to him. "I would we might have our chance," he said. But it would be folly for you to let my disaster influence your life. You never have seen my face even, señorita. You could forget me. You could walk from this place and surrender, send word to Don Diego Vega that you will become his bride, and the governor then would be forced to release you and clear your parents of all blame.
Ah, señor!
Think, señorita, think what it would mean. His Excellency would not dare stand an instant against a Vega. Your parents would have their lands restored. You would be the bride of the richest young man in the country. You would have everything to make you happy.
Everything except love, señor, and without love the rest is as naught.
Think, señorita, and decide for once and all. You have but a moment now.
I made my decision long ago, señor. A Pulido loves but once, and does not wed where she cannot love.
Cara! He cried, and pressed her close again. Now there came a battering at the door. Señor Zorro! Sergeant Gonzalez cried.
Well, señor?
Zorro asked.
I have an offer for you from His Excellency the Governor.
I am listening, loud one.
His Excellency has no wish to cause your death or injury to the señorita you have inside with you. He asks that you open the door and come out with the lady.
To what end? Señor Zorro asked.
You shall be given a fair trial, and the señorita also. Thus you may escape death and receive imprisonment instead.
Ha! I have seen samples of His Excellency's fair trials, Señor Zorro responded. Think you I am an imbecile?
His Excellency bids me say that this is the last chance, that the offer will not be renewed.
His Excellency is wise not to waste breath renewing it. He grows fat, and his breath is short.
What can you expect to gain by resistance, save death? Gonzales asked. How can you hope to offstand 1.5 score of us?
It has been done before, loud one.
We can batter in the door and take you.
After a few of you have been stretched lifeless on the floor, Señor Zorro observed. Who will be the first through the door, my sergeant?
For the last time.
Come in and drink a mug of wine with me, said the highwayman, laughing.
Mealmush and goat's milk,
swore Sergeant Gonzalez. There was quiet then, for a time, and Señor Zorro, glancing through the window cautiously, so as not to attract a pistol shot, observed that the governor was in consultation with the sergeant and certain of the troopers. The consultation ended, and Señor Zorro darted back from the window. Almost immediately the attack upon the door began. They were pounding at it with heavy timbers, trying to smash it down. Señor Zorro, standing in the middle of the room, pointed his pistol at the door and fired, and as the ball tore through the wood and somebody outside gave a shriek of pain, he darted to the table and started loading the pistol again. Then he hurried across to the door and observed the hole where the bullet had gone through. The plank had been split, and there was quite a crack in it. Señor Zorro put the point of his blade at this crack and waited. Again the heavy timber crashed against the door, and some trooper threw his weight against it also. Señor Zorro's blade darted through the crack like a streak of lightning, and came back red, and again there was a shriek outside. And now a volley of pistol balls came through the door, but Señor Zorro, laughing, had sprung back out of harm's way.
Well done, señor,
Señorita Lolita cried. We shall stamp our mark on several of these hounds before we are done, he replied.
I would that I could aid you, señor.
You are doing it, señorita. It is your love that gives me my strength.
If I could use a blade.
Ah, señorita, that is for a man to do. Do you pray that all may be well.
And at the last, señor, if it is seen that there is no hope, may I then see your dear face?
I swear it, señorita, and feel my arms about you, and my lips on yours. Death will not be so bitter then. The attack on the door was renewed. Now pistol shots were coming through it regularly, and through the one open window also, and there was nothing for Señor Zorro to do except stand in the middle of the room and wait, his blade held ready. There would be a lively few minutes, he promised, when the door was down and they rushed in at him. It seemed to be giving way now. The señorita crept close to him, tears streaming down her cheeks, and grasped him by the arm.
You will not forget? She asked.
I'll not forget, señorita.
Just before they break down the door, señor, take me in your arms and let me see your dear face, and kiss me. Then I can die with good grace, too.
You must live.
Not to be sent to a foul carcel, señor. And what would life be without you?
There is Don Diego.
I can think of nobody but you, señor. Apolito will know how to die, and perhaps my death will bring home to men the perfidy of the governor. Perhaps it may be of service.
Again the heavy timber struck against the door. They could hear His Excellency shouting encouragement to the troopers, could hear the natives shrieking, and Sergeant Gonzales crying his orders in his loud voice. Señor Zorro hurried to the window again, chancing a bullet, and glanced out. He saw that half a dozen troopers had their blades ready, were prepared to rush over the door the moment it was down. They would get him, but he would get some of them first. Again the ram against the door.
It is almost the end, señor, the girl whispered.
I know it, señorita.
I would we had had better fortune, yet I can die gladly since this love has been in my life. Now, señor, your face and lips. The door is crashing in.
She ceased to sob and lifted her face bravely. Señor Zorro sighed, and one hand fumbled with the bottom of his mask. But suddenly there was a tumult outside in the plaza, and the battering at the door ceased, and they could hear loud voices that they had not heard before. Señor Zorro let go of his mask and darted to the window. Chapter 38. The Man Unmasked. 23 horsemen were galloping into the plaza. The beasts they rode were magnificent. Their saddles and bridles were heavily chased with silver. Their cloaks were of the finest materials, and they wore hats with plumes as if this was somewhat of a dress affair, and they wished the world to know it. Each man sat straight and proud in his saddle, his blade at his side, and every blade had a jewelled hilt, being at once serviceable and a rich ornament. They galloped along the face of the tavern, between the door and the soldiers who had been battering it, between the building and the governor and assembled citizens, and there they turned and stood their horses side by side, facing His Excellency. "Wait! There is a better way," their leader cried.
"Ha!" screeched the governor. "I understand. Here we have the young men of all the noble families in the Southland. They have come to show their loyalty by taking this curse of Capistrano. I thank you, caballeros. Yet it is not my wish to have any of you slain by this fellow. He is not worthy your blades, señores. Do you ride to one side, and lend the strength of your presence, and let my troopers deal with the rogue. Again, I thank you for this show of loyalty, for this demonstration that you stand for law and order and all it means, for constituted authority."
"Peace!" their leader cried. "Your Excellency, we represent power in this section, do we not?"
"You do, caballeros," the governor said.
"Our families say who shall rule, what laws shall be termed just, do they not?"
"They have great influence," the governor said.
"You would not care to stand alone against us?"
"Most assuredly not," His Excellency cried. "But I pray you let the troopers get this fellow. It is not seemly that a caballero should suffer wound or death from his blade."
"It is to be regretted that you do not understand."
"Understand?" queried the governor in a questioning tone, glancing up and down the line of mounted men.
"We have taken counsel with ourselves, Excellency. We know our strength and power, and we have decided upon certain things. There have been things done that we cannot countenance. The frailes of the missions have been despoiled by officials. Natives have been treated worse than dogs. Even men of noble blood have been robbed because they have not been friendly to the ruling powers."
"Caballero!"
"Peace, Excellency, until I have done."
This thing came to a crisis when a hidalgo and his wife and daughter were thrown into a carcel by your orders. Such a thing cannot be countenanced, Excellency. And so we have banded ourselves together, and here we take a hand. Be it known that we ourselves rode with this Señor Zorro when he invaded the carcel and rescued the prisoners, that we carried Don Carlos and the Doña Catalina to places of safety, and that we have pledged our words and honors and blades, that they may not be persecuted more. I would say, silence, until I have done. We stand together, and the strength of our united families is behind us. Call upon your soldiers to attack us if you dare. Every man of noble blood up and down the length of El Camino Real would flock to our defense, would unseat you from your office, would see you humbled. We await your answer, Excellency. What would you? His Excellency gasped. First, proper consideration for Don Carlos Pulido and his family. No carcel for them. If you have the courage to try them for treason, be sure that we will be on hand at the trial, and deal with any man who gives perjured testimony, and with any magistrado who does not conduct himself properly. We are determined, Excellency. Perhaps I was hasty in the matter, but I was led to believe certain things, the governor said. I grant you your wish. One side now, caballeros, while my men get at this rogue in the tavern. We are not done, their leader said. We have things to say regarding this Señor Zorro. What has he done, actually, Excellency? Is he guilty of any treason? He has robbed no man except those who robbed the defenseless first. He has whipped a few unjust persons. He has taken sides with the persecuted, for which we honor him. To do such a thing, he took his life in his own hands. He successfully evaded your soldiers. He resented insults as any man has the right to do. What would you? A complete pardon, here and now, for this man known as Señor Zorro. Never! The governor cried. He has affronted me personally. He shall die the death. He turned around and saw Don Alejandro Vega standing near him. Don Alejandro, you are the most influential man in this south country, he said. You are the one man against whom even the governor dare not stand. You are a man of justice. Tell these young caballeros that what they wish cannot be granted. Bid them return to their homes, and this show of treason will be forgotten. I stand behind them, Don Alejandro thundered. You stand behind them? I do, Your Excellency. I echo every word they have spoken in your presence. Persecution must cease. Grant their requests. See that your officials do right hereafter. Return to San Francisco de Asís, and I take my oath that there shall be no treason in this Southland. I shall see to it myself. But oppose them, Excellency, and I shall take sides against you, see you driven from office and ruined, and your foul parasites with you. This terrible, willful Southland, the governor cried. Your answer, Don Alejandro demanded. I can do nothing but agree, the governor said. But there is one thing. Well? I spare the man's life if he surrenders, but he must stand trial for the murder of Captain Ramon. Murder? Queried the leader of the caballeros. It was a duel between gentlemen, Excellency. Señor Zorro resented an insult on the part of the commandante to the señorita. Ha! But Ramon was a caballero. And so is this Señor Zorro. He told us as much, and we believe him, for there was no falsehood in his voice. So it was a duel, Excellency, and between gentlemen, according to the code. And Captain Ramon was unfortunate that he was not a better man with a blade. That is understood. Your answer. I agree, the governor said weakly. I pardon him, and I go home to San Francisco de Asís, and persecution ceases in this locality. But I hold Don Alejandro to his promise that there will be no treason against me here if I do these things.
I have given my word, Don Alejandro said. The caballeros shrieked their happiness and dismounted. They drove the soldiers away from the door, Sergeant Gonzalez growling into his moustache because here was a reward gone glimmering again.
Within there, Señor Zorro, one cried. Have you heard?
I have heard, caballero.
Open the door and come out amongst us, a free man.
There was a moment's hesitation, and then the battered door was unbarred and opened, and Señor Zorro stepped out with the señorita on his arm. He stopped just in front of the door, removed his sombrero, and bowed low before them. A good day to you, caballeros, he cried. Sergeant, I regret that you have missed the reward, but I shall see that the amount is placed to the credit of you and your men with the landlord of the tavern.
By the saints, he is a caballero, Gonzalez cried.
Unmask, man, cried the governor.
I would see the features of the person who has fooled my troopers, has gained caballeros to his banner, and has forced me to make a compromise.
I fear that you will be disappointed when you see my poor features, Señor Zorro replied. Do you expect me to look like Satan? Or can it be possible, on the other hand, that you believe I have an angelic countenance? He chuckled, glanced down at the Señorita Lolita, and then put up a hand and tore off his mask. A chorus of gasps answered the motion, an explosive oath or two from the soldiers, cries of delight from the caballeros, and a screech of mingled pride and joy from one old hidalgo. Don Diego, my son! My son! And the man before them seemed to droop suddenly in the shoulders, and sighed, and spoke in a languid voice.
These be turbulent times. Can a man never meditate on music and the poets?
And Don Diego Vega, the curse of Capistrano, was clasped for a moment in his father's arms. Chapter 39. Mealmush and Goat's Milk. They crowded forward, troopers, natives, caballeros, surrounding Don Diego Vega and the señorita who clutched at his arm, and looked up at him from proud and glistening eyes. Explain! Explain! They cried. It began 10 years ago, when I was but a lad of 15, he said. I heard tales of persecution. I saw my friends, the frailes, annoyed and robbed. I saw soldiers beat an old native who was my friend, and then I determined to play this game. It would be a difficult game to play, I knew, so I pretended to have small interest in life, so that men never would connect my name with that of the highwayman I expected to become. In secret, I practiced horsemanship, and learned how to handle a blade. By the saints, he did! Sergeant Gonzalez growled. One half of me was the languid Don Diego you all knew, and the other half was the curse of Capistrano I hoped one day to be. And then the time came, and my work began. It is a peculiar thing to explain, signores. The moment I donned cloak and mask, the Don Diego part of me fell away. My body straightened. New blood seemed to course through my veins. My voice grew strong and firm. Fire came to me. And the moment I removed cloak and mask, I was the languid Don Diego again. Is it not a peculiar thing? I had made friends with this great Sergeant Gonzalez, and for a purpose.
Ha! I guessed the purpose, caballeros, Gonzalez cried. You tired whenever the Señor Zorro was mentioned, and did not wish to hear of violence and bloodshed, but always you asked me in what direction I was going with my troopers, and you went in the other direction and did your confounded work.
You are an excellent guesser, said Don Diego, laughing, as did the others about him. I even crossed blades with you, so that you would not guess I was Señor Zorro. You remember the rainy night at the tavern. I listened to your boasts, went out and donned mask and cloak, came in and fought you, escaped, took off mask and cloak, and returned to jest with you.
Ha!
I visited the Pulido hacienda as Don Diego, and a short time later returned as Señor Zorro and held speech with the señorita here. You almost had me, Sergeant, that night at Fray Felipe's, the first night, I mean.
Ha! You told me there that you had not seen Senor Zorro.
Nor had I. The Fray does not keep a mirror, thinking that it makes for vanity. The other things were not difficult, of course. You can easily imagine how, as Senor Zorro, I happened to be at my own house in town when the comandante insulted the señorita. And the señorita must forgive me the deception. I courted her as Don Diego, and she would have none of me. Then I tried it as Senor Zorro, and the saints were kind, and she gave me her love. Perhaps there was some method in that also, for she turned from the wealth of Don Diego Vega to the man she loved, though she deemed him then an outcast and outlaw. She has showed me her true heart, and I am rejoiced at it. Your Excellency, this señorita is to become my wife, and I take it you will think twice before you will annoy her family further." His Excellency threw out his hands in a gesture of resignation. "It was difficult to fool you all, but it has been done," Don Diego continued. "Only years of practice allowed me to accomplish it. And now Senor Zorro shall ride no more, for there will be no need, and moreover a married man should take some care of his life."
"And what man do I wed?" the Señorita Lolita asked, blushing because she spoke the words where all could hear.
"What man do you love?"
"I had fancied that I loved Senor Zorro, but it comes to me now that I love the both of them," she said. "Is it not shameless? But I would rather have you, Senor Zorro, than the old Don Diego I knew."
"We shall endeavour to establish a golden mean," he replied, laughing again. "I shall drop the old languid ways and change gradually into the man you would have me. People will say that marriage made a man of me." He stooped and kissed her there before them all.
"Meal mush and goat's milk,"
swore Sergeant Gonzales.